Christian Riley here. I'm a producer, mixer, and musician based in Los Angeles. I also play guitar in a band called Bandie, and I produce and mix all the Bandie music right here in my studio, Yardlight Studio. So, welcome to A Whole Production. This is a new series that I'm going to be doing that will be long form breakdowns of my production and mixing process. We're going to start with demos and songwriting, sort of how the song came about. Then we'll go into each phase of the recording process to see how I recorded and layered things. And then we'll end with a deep dive into my mixing process. So the first song that we're going to be breaking down is one of my favorite songs that I've ever worked on, and that would be Figured Out by Bandie. Now, Figured Out was released on Halloween 2024. It's the second single from the Bandie LP that will come out later on in 2025. So let's listen to a snippet of the song and then we can check it out.
It's in my head, so fucking loud. We might be dead, all we're singing now. It's in my head, it's all I hear now. We might be dead, can we figure it out?
That was a little snippet of the chorus, a little performance reel that we did back in fall of 2024 to promote the song. That was myself and Brian in the video. So now that we've heard the song, let's dive into the demo session and we can see how we wrote the song. It might also be useful to just explain what a demo is. So a demo is basically that proof of concept that's going to get you to the record. And in the demo stage, we're often still, changing out parts. We could be doing some songwriting still or changing out the arrangement. But once we get into that first recording session where we're going to be, recording parts that are going to be on the record, we really want to know what the arrangement is. And the demo gives us some assurance to figure out what all that's going to be before that first session. And the first session that we're working towards in a rock production is going to be the drum session. Okay, so here's the Pro Tools session for the demo for Figured Out. Right here, you can see some stems that were originally imported in from Logic. So our singer Brian had come up with this original idea. And to begin with, this is really all we had. I'll play it for you now.
I got it figured out now. I guess it only took you coming around. I got it figured out now. I guess it only took you coming around.
So you can hear it just repeats. But yeah, that was all we had to begin with, was just the chord progression, the melody, and the first two lyrics of the song. So, I was kicking around some different ideas. It started out as kind of this mellow thing, which is what the verse really ended up being, is this kind of chill vibe. I kind of had the idea to make it a little more of a rockin' chorus. And that's when we kind of get into this world where it becomes a quiet, loud, quiet song. If you're not familiar with that terminology, quiet, loud, quiet is like a tradition in alternative rock, started by the Pixies, but utilized by many bands since then. Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit is a quiet, loud, quiet song. And really what it means is, you have a quiet part, you have a loud part. So we're talking about dynamics here. Okay, so let's listen to the first version of the chorus and post-chorus for Figured Out. Into the verse. So yeah, at this stage, we didn't have any vocals for the chorus. We just had some parts, and it might be worth explaining how we came up with those parts. So this track right here these are MIDI drums. So these are programmed drums, and that can be very useful in the demo stage, just so you can get an idea of what the drum parts are going to be. This is a template for our drum recording, which will come a little bit later. Now, you also hear the post chorus even has that sort of way less cool version of the lead guitar that comes in this version, only in the post chorus. So we're still sorting through parts here, trying to figure out what this song is going to be at this phase. And we were still figuring out what the chorus was going to be, even. So this is sort of that stoppy, starty part that ends up coming in later in the song. So we did end up using this part, but it wasn't for the chorus. The thing that ended up being the chorus was this, and so we have this on chorus 2. So really a stronger part for the chorus than this sort of stoppy, starty thing that I originally had done in chorus 1. But that part, if you're familiar with the tune, ends up happening later on in chorus 3. So that part ended up being useful, but just not for chorus 1. Let's check out the bridge. So all that is pretty much verbatim what we ended up doing on the album in terms of parts and guitar chords and things like that. Okay, let's check out the bridge going into the breakdown and chorus 3. There's our stoppy, starty chorus that we originally had as chorus 1. That ends up being the thing that comes out of the whole bridge section. So we did use that part, ended up putting it in chorus 3. Other than that, I mean, the bridge and the breakdown, compositionally speaking, are exactly what ended up on the record. You know, some slightly different drum fills, etc. But the other thing that was different, after the breakdown, we get into this part. And that's going down now to more what the chorus chords are. But what we ended up doing, and we ended up calling this the back to bridge part, we changed this part to be the same chords as the bridge. You can hear that we're still kind of sorting through the parts here at this phase. Don't have the complete song yet. And another thing that I'd like to mention, I know I mentioned this before, but we still didn't have a chorus vocal. Yeah, so leading into that drum session, still didn't have a chorus vocal. I was in a bit of a panic because I believed in the song. So what happened was the night before the session, I basically stayed up really late at night trying to come up with a chorus vocal. And after chiseling away for hours, I finally came up with a vocal that is the vocal that you hear on the record. And a little bit of spontaneity there because, yeah, I basically showed up to the drum session and sang the vocal to Brian, our singer, and he loved it. So I knew we had something that we could work with, and we were able to proceed and record the drums. It is a good idea to have the song written before you record drums. Of course, we're not recording the final version yet on the vocals, but it is a good idea to have an idea of what the vocal is going to be because that can affect things like kick patterns, accents, and drum fills, which are the things that we kind of scrutinize when we are recording drums. We're kind of down to the last minute with that vocal melody, but that was very much the story of Figured Out. You know, some songs you go in, you might make a demo, and executing on the final version is really just re-recording all the demo parts and just kind of getting tighter performances and better sounds. Not the case with Figured Out. This was a song that we ended up changing many, many times during the production process, as you'll see. Okay, now that we've looked at the demo, let's dive into drums. Now, the drums were recorded at a studio called 64 Sound, which is in Highland Park, close by where we live. And we have a great relationship with this studio. We did all the drums for our album at this studio. Actually, almost all the drums. A couple songs were recorded by our friend Scott Seaver at his home, but most of the songs were done at 64 Sound. So let's take a look at the microphone setup and the drum kit that we used at 64 Sound. Okay, so here's the kit set up at 64 Sound. And yeah, I mentioned one of the reasons we love working here is because it's already set up and ready to go. So once we arrive, we basically just need to kind of dial in sounds and we can get recording quite quickly. There's Joey Grabmeyer behind the kit. Joey sadly moved back to the East Coast, so we're not working with him anymore, but he's an incredible drummer, an incredible musician, and a wonderful human. One of the reasons I love working with Joey is because he will play all day until we get it right. And that's kind of, a hallmark of all the great drummers. They take feedback really well and they'll keep playing until you get it right in the studio. So, really appreciate Joey's involvement on our project. Go over a little bit of the microphone setup here. So, can't see it here, but there's a 57 on the snare, some kind of pencil condenser for the bottom of the snare. I can't really see it here, but 421s on the toms, right? Here we've got a FET 47 outside of the kick drum. This is a common tactic to use a FET 47 outside. This microphone tends to capture more of the low end of the kick drum. On the inside, we have a AKG D112, which really gets sort of the clicky attack of the kick drum. Right here, we've got some of these Octava pencil condenser mics, and these are just spot mics for the ride cymbal and the hi-hat. Not pictured, but up here there are some kind of condensers for the overhead mics. Right here, we've got a tube condenser mic that is being used as a kit mic, as it's called. So a kit mic is something that's just, 6 feet away from the kit, or maybe that's even less than that. And the kit mic really just kind of gets an overall picture of the drum sound. Here's another angle. You can see that 57 on the snare. We've got this big fat snare drum dampening ring on the snare drum, which is pretty key. Without something like this, you get a really ringy snare drum. And that's something that we very much want to control in the studio so we're talking about the decay of the snare drum. We usually want to shorten that a little bit so it doesn't ping, like ring really long. And that's what we get with this big fat snare drum ring. You can see we've also got some dampening on the toms as well. So some napkins taped on here, some of these moon gels. These things are just kind of dampening up the drums to make sure that they don't ring too much. Here's some of the gear at 64 Sound. Again, I'm not really sure everything that we used on the recording because our homie Tyler was the one doing the engineering, but we're always in good hands with Tyler. Tyler's an incredible engineer, so we just kind of let him do his thing, and we're always happy with the result. I know that we were using quite a few preamps, that is, from this Harrison console, which is the console at 64 Sound. And here I am behind the console capturing takes, and you can see I've got my little notebook here. What I do in the studio is I take notes in the moment to recognize when the parts feel really good. And this helps me for later on. It makes my comping much more efficient. If you're not familiar with comping, that's when we're compiling all the different takes into one master take. Now, in between takes, I'm giving Joey feedback and or specific direction. I'll also go into the live room and tune the snare drum in between takes. So if you're not familiar, you can tune the snare drum to the key of the song, and it kind of makes the drum kit sing a little better with the tune. So what'll happen is as the song goes on and he hits the snare drum, it kind of tends to go a little flat. So sometimes we'll even need to stop the take and, tune it in the middle of the song. But it really makes the whole drum kit sing a little better. And then I'll take those drum takes, which have been recorded into playlists in Pro Tools, and I'll bring them back to my studio for the comp. So let's go ahead and check out the drum comping process. Okay, here's the session for the drum comp. Here you can see all the different playlists. So these are going to be those different takes that we did back at 64 Sound. Again, I took notes as to which parts I liked, and that's basically what I'm going off of to assemble the comp. So yeah, this is like take 15. This is take 11. It looks like take 11 was pretty good because we've got a few regions here that were from that take. So yeah, basically what I'm doing there is I've got all the tracks grouped. So yeah, and these are all those individual microphones we were talking about. Here's that AKG D112. Here's the FET 47. This would be the snare top 57, et cetera, et cetera. And all these tracks are grouped. You see right down here, there's a drums all group. So, I can solo or mute them all at once. And basically what I'm doing as I go along is, let's say I wanted to pull something from take 7. I would grab the section here. I would do the Command C or copy feature, put that into my current playlist. I usually put the comp on the very top. So that means it would be number 14. And then I paste it in. This is the comp that we ended up on. So, there's a bunch of different takes here, but this is normal. I'm grabbing the best sections, the very, very best cream of the crop parts for each section to assemble this master take. And then I might also need to kind of go into these sections here and move the specific cutoff point. So I'll do that, but I usually actually do that after the editing stage, which comes next. Cool, I just want to play you a little bit of the comped drums, and we'll take a listen to that snare drum so we can hear the tuning. And here I'll solo the snare drum. Bong! It's a C, and that's the key of the song too. It goes D, F, C, G, in C, C major. And so the snare drum is tuned to the tonic of the song. One more thing I'd like to mention about the drums on Figured Out is that the chorus was something that we spent quite a bit of time on in the studio. Verses are fairly simple kick snare patterns, but the chorus really ended up being kind of like almost a drum solo. So we took a lot of time making sure that we had all the right fills and accents that would go along with the vocal. Okay, next up is drum editing. So we've got a comp, and that's basically this master take that is assembled out of all these other takes, right? And we could very easily use that, and sometimes I do use that. Sometimes I will just use the live drum take. But for this project, we kind of wanted to polish it up just a little more. And so for that, we use this feature of Pro Tools called Beat Detective. And Beat Detective is awesome. I've been using it for years. You can basically go in and chop out every single note and then quantize or correct things to percentages so that you can get the feel of the drums to be exactly the way that you want. This is useful mostly because what will happen is between these two different takes, there might be variances in drift. Like he might be playing a little ahead on the chorus, that's common, and then he might be playing a little bit behind on the verse. And what will happen is they'll kind of pull apart from each other. So the transition point when you're going into the next section might feel a little funny. So if we use Beat Detective, we can kind of add a little bit of correction over those sections, and you can apply that throughout the whole song in varying amounts and get it to feel exactly the way you want. So let's check out the Beat Detective editing. All right, drum editing with Beat Detective. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new playlist. So we'll go ahead and duplicate. That's just taking the comp and making that the top playlist, currently 26 in this session. And then let's take a section just to demonstrate how this works. So I'm going to take chorus 2 up until, so this is just a piece of the comp. This was that good take 11 that we were using. And first thing I want to do, make sure it's cut to a quarter note because Beat Detective gets a little messed up if you try to go on the 8th note. So we'll open Beat Detective, Command 8, or it's up here in this menu right here. And I'll go Capture Selection, right? So that's going to be this section that we just selected, making sure this matches that. We'll go to first Clip Separation, okay? And I'm going to hit this Analyze. button. Give it a second. And now we've got some detected trigger points here. So that's what these are right here. Because of the tempo, what is it, 82? Yeah. That 16th notes is actually 30-second notes, and we do have that in this section. So let's include 30-second notes. But then we can also kind of go through here and look, do these trigger points add up to what the drum hits are? And it looks like they are. Let's play a little bit of it just to listen. One point of contention may be this flam part here. I'd like to listen to this. It looks like it cut it pretty evenly on the notes, so I think we're good there. And then we'll go ahead and hit the separate button, but one thing to note is that we do have a trigger pad, so that just gives a little bit of a leader where the actual cut happens. And then, it's still being cut on the transient, but for reference, it's going to go ahead of it so we don't get the two regions kind of cutting in on the transient. This is definitely a good idea. So I recommend a trigger pad from 4 to 6 milliseconds. Boom, now we've cut everything up into the separate takes. Now we can go into clip conform, and this is where you can really play with this. Depending on the tune, it might need something different. Some songs need a little bit of a swing, right? Some drummers, you need to correct a lot to get a great drum take. Some, you don't have to do much at all. We're not going for a super heavy-handed approach, so I might go somewhere in the middle here. And then this exclude within is going to be something that will exclude certain notes that are pretty on to begin with. So you can play with these levers too to make it feel the way you want. But let's go ahead and hit conform. Boom. You can see things just slid just a little bit. I'll hit this edit smoothing, which is important. This is going to fill in the gaps and also give me some crossfades in between each region. And now we can listen. Feels great, haven't done a ton of correction, but I'm already digging the way that sounds. But you can possibly hear some artifacts of the edits in there, and that's something that we need to address. So, this kind of opens up a bit of a can of worms in terms of the regions. But what I will do just to be doubly sure when I'm doing this is I actually go through every single region, and if I feel like I need to, then I will drag out to make sure I'm not cutting on any transient. That's the point. You can also get a better 0 point crossing if you drag it out. Sometimes it'll just sound better, making sure I'm not getting on any transient. That's the same thing right here as the trigger pad. I'm just kind of increasing the trigger pad on certain hits. But yeah, you might want to go through and proofread just to make sure it's not cutting on any transients. That is important. But overall, I'm digging the way this sounds. This one might need to come out. And so once we've done that, we can take the section and consolidate it. And then the whole thing is one section now. So I just did this for demonstration, but it sort of varies per section. So one section might just get 20%. Right? Another section, I might want to go a little more heavy-handed. The key is that the two sections sort of line up and feel good together as a cohesive take. So I'm kind of going off of the transition points between the comp pieces and varying the amount and making sure that it all feels good. And then I also will, after the fact, also go in and maybe knock a few notes ahead or behind intentionally just to make sure that there's also this element of kind of randomness and feel. Snares can often sound good just a little behind. So if they're too rigid, I might knock the snares behind. And then what you end up with is this master take that sort of has this sheen to it where every section feels great and there's no drift in between sections, and we get the feel exactly the way we want. And that's a great, backdrop for adding instrumentation. Okay, next up is bass guitar. Now, the bass has only one layer. This is kind of just a basic distinction I'd like to make for this type of record. I mean, that's actually true for all music production, is that there's really generally one instrument holding down the low end in the mono field, meaning it's in the middle of the stereo field, right? And that is definitely true in a rock production, just like it is true with most, electronic or pop productions as well. There's one low end instrument in the center. So let's take a look at the instrument that we use, and then I'll explain the technical setup. And one more thing I'd like to mention about the bass before we check out the technical setup and the tracks that we recorded is that the part is in drop D. Now, what that means, if you're not familiar, is that the low E string is tuned down to a D, so a whole step below E. Okay, so here is the bass that we used on Figured Out and actually on the whole Bandie record. It's a 90s reissue P bass. I think it's an early 70s reissue. That's our bassist Andrew playing it at a show that we did in LA back in 2024. One other thing I'd like to mention about recording bass and guitar is that it's always a good idea to get your instrument set up before you do a recording session. There can be variances in intonation based on the temperature and humidity that the instrument was stored in. So you want to make sure you get a setup before you do tracking to make sure everything's nice and in tune. Now, that one layer of bass is then captured on two separate tracks. So what we have here is a GB tracker by Undertone Audio. This is the box that we use to split the signal. So the bass goes in here into the input. We then have 1/4 inch output that can go to an amp. In this case, I'm actually going to a 1073 preamp. And then in the back of this, we've got an XLR out that's going to go line into the second channel of my Apollo. So I'm capturing at the same time one that is basically the amp signal, and then that other track is going to be a pure DI signal. In the case that I want to reamp the bass and run it through some different amplifiers, I have that option later on. So I'm a big fan of this box, the Undertone Audio GB Tracker. If you're not familiar with Undertone Audio, it's a company started by Eric Valentine, a producer that I worked with years ago making the Citizen King record. And Undertone Audio is an incredible company. They're kind of like the gold standard for hardware in the recording world. And this box right here just does one very, very specific thing, and that is that it takes that unbalanced 1/4 inch signal and it turns it into that DI signal, and that ends up being the purest, cleanest DI signal known to mankind. I know this because Eric Valentine exhaustively researched it, and I've used this in many scenarios, and I'm super happy with the results. So yeah, this is kind of key in the setup in terms of splitting the signal and getting the DI and then the amp signal in. Then, yeah, this is the 1/4 inch in on my Apollo. So this is the other piece of gear that is essential to my guitar recording and bass recording. And that's the amp signal going into the 1/4 inch here. So that's going to be channel 1. This is an XLR to balanced 1/4 inch, which goes into input 2 on the Apollo Twin. And then I hit the preamp button and select the line input for that. Then I'm able to capture both of those signals. And let's check out the Pro Tools session for the bass recording. So yeah, we've got all my edited drums here. Starting to get into my color coding system here, which is taken directly from Andrew Sheps's template, which is what I use for mixing. More on that later. But yeah, so basically all my drum tracks are now this dark purple or deep purple, if you will. And then here you got this lighter purple is going to be the bass. There's my 1073 track that I mentioned. So that's a slightly more colored DI. And then the GB Tracker track right here. Not too much that's like really remarkable performance-wise on this song. I mean, it's basically following the roots of the chords and, just kind of holding it down. There is a cool moment here before chorus 1 where there's a little slide. I'll play that for you now. if you're familiar with the song, you might notice that that was a different chord at the end of the chorus before it gets into the pre-chorus. We actually changed that chord later on in the game. More on that later. One more thing I'd like to mention about the bass recording before we get into guitars is that, yeah, the bass is recorded to just the drums. So the drums recorded to those scratch tracks or those stems that came from the demo. But the bass, when we record the bass, we are just listening to only drums and bass. And that way we're able to really lock in and go under the microscope and make sure that the bass and drums are locking in as tight as possible. Okay, next up is guitars, and it might be worth talking a little bit about our strategy here. So, we mentioned that the bass guitar is living in the middle and it's not layered. But with the guitars, we do what's called doubling. And with doubling guitars, what we're doing is we're capturing one performance and then we're panning it all the way to the left. Then we're capturing a different performance with a different guitar and then we're panning that one all the way to the right. And what this does is it creates this very wide, big guitar sound that is sort of the hallmark of most modern rock recordings. And the sounds need to be different. So that's why we use a different guitar, but you don't want them to be too different because then it might not get that balance that you're going for. And you also don't want them to be the same. So if you use the same guitar on both sides, you don't really get a very wide sound. It just kind of collapses. But if you do same amp, but different guitar on each side, that's going to give you that big wide rock sound that we love. Let me show you a little clip of the guitar recording. This is a shot of myself and Brian tracking the guitars for the bridge of Figured Out. So that's a shot of me recording the bridge part for Figured Out with my Telecaster Custom. That guitar has wrapped single coil pickups, so it's slightly hotter. And worth mentioning as well, since we are doing that doubling of guitars, what I like to do is record each guitar as a separate pass, meaning even when I'm recording the second guitar, I have the first guitar muted and I just let the guitar live in the middle so I can just kind of hear it very focused, zero in on those performances again. Now, the whole Bandie album is basically my Telecaster Custom on one side, and on the other side, it's my Jazzmaster Custom. So that's how we get that wide guitar sound by having different guitars on each side. And here's my guitar rig. You can see some of the pedals that I was using on the record. And there's my Jazzmaster Custom, the Troy Van Leeuwen model. Love that guitar. So we were using fuzz pedals for this part because it's a really rockin' part. And it's a very saturated sound that utilizes odd order harmonics. Now, there's a couple different types of fuzz pedals. You may have heard of the Big Muff. We did use the Russian green Big Muff on one side of the chorus guitars. This is the first track, the Telly, and you can see we're using the Bermuda Triangle, a type of fuzz pedal. This is the software version on the unison slot and console here. This unison slot is cool. It captures the audio at high impedance, so it's just like plugging into a pedal when you use this. That then goes into the Marshall Plexi, and I think I left these settings stock, and then into an API EQ that's basically just boosting a little bit of 1K to get some mid-range and knocking out a little bit of 100 to manage the bottom end. The other side of the guitars has nothing on the unison slot. That's because we were using the Russian green Big Muff pedal. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But that's going through the Plexi Classic, right? So it's a slightly different amp, slightly different fuzz pedal. And then that's going into the API as well, doing the same EQ moves. We're knocking off a little 100, boosting some 1K. And here's a photo of the Russian green Big Muff and the settings that we use. If you're not familiar with this pedal, it's pretty famous. It's kind of like a big part of the shoegaze sound. But this is what we used on the Jazzmaster track. Okay, so we'll check out some of the chorus guitars. Might be worth mentioning at this point too that all of the separate guitar parts were done in separate passes. So we got all of the chorus guitars done. Layer 1 left, layer 2 right, and then we moved on to the verse rhythm guitars and then moved on to the lead guitars. And when we track just one guitar, I'm keeping it in mono. Like this is what you would hear if we were tracking. Just solo the guitar a little bit so you can hear it. This is the first layer. So yeah, that's the Telly with the Bermuda Triangle. And again, tracked it in mono, but then what happens is we track the next layer also in mono. So that'd be this one. And you can hear it sounds similar, but different enough that the two guitars definitely are distinctive. Also, note that I'm always capturing that DI as well. Even though I have it turned down and it's not really activated, it's always there and it becomes useful later on in the mix process, as you'll see. But then we add the two guitars together. We take Telly 1, pan it left all the way. We take Oxy, guitar 2, we pan it right all the way. And now you can hear the stereo guitars for the chorus. So yeah, just a really thick and powerful sound. That's really that fuzz pedal coming through on both tracks. So we got some lead guitar parts to check out too. There's a chill part that comes in the verses, and then also a lead part in the chorus that's doubled. We'll get to that in a second. Pretty much all the lead guitars, I'm using the same amp, and that's this amp right here, the Chandler GAV-19. I love this amp. It's a little brighter than the Bosom Betty, which has a nice deep low mid to it. So I tend to like this one for leads or things that are a little more trebly. And right here I'm utilizing that treble boost, but these settings are pretty stock. So I'll play you a little bit of that lead guitar that comes in the middle of the verse. One more cool guitar part to show you, and that would be the guitar part for the chorus, the lead guitar. Pretty much the same technical setup as the verse lead guitar, going through that Chandler GAV-19. But for this one, we use this pedal, and this is I love this pedal. This is the JHS Bonsai. And so if you're not familiar, this is all the different versions of the Tube Screamer and then some. So if you're not familiar, the Tube Screamer is a famous Ibanez pedal that a lot of rock guitarists use. This one gives you a little more options. So for this, we were just using it to get a little bit of a tone boost before the amp, really not driving it much, but giving it a little bit of gain going into the amp. And I'll play you a little bit of the chorus guitar. Going into the bridge, it plays an octave higher. So you can hear it's a little grittier. That's the Tube Screamer, that JHS Bonsai, giving it just a little more gain for the chorus part, but also doubled. But one thing to note is that we're panning them, but they're a little further in. So yeah, they're doubled, but they're not hard pan like the rhythm guitars. They're sort of living in the middle of the sides. One more cool part to show you, and that is the lead that comes in on verse 2. This part is a super fuzzy, tense, distorted part that came in, and it really kind of sets the tone for the tension of the song. You know, there's sort of this ominous feeling, and so this guitar part really accentuates the ominous feeling of the song. And that last part is my Jazz Master plugged into the Russian Green Big Muff going into the Chandler GAV19 like a lot of the other leads. One more really cool thing that we did on this song that I've actually never done before on a record was we changed a chord in the chorus super late in the game. We had already been recording vocals and kind of in the flow of finishing. And for me, the song was just getting a little bit repetitive. So I went on this mission to change a chord. I actually didn't even know if it was going to work, but I did have all of those sounds charted, right? So I had the console session for each guitar part saved, and I also had the pedal settings saved in a photo. Same thing with the bass as well. The bass was also charted. So basically, I had all the settings I need to just change one chord, even though most of the song had already been recorded. And yeah, it just helps to add a little more cadence at the end of the chorus. It's at that moment where he says, "Can we figure it out?" So it's the very last repetition of that line. There's really just 2/8 notes that instead of going to the low A, it's going to a B, which is a minor chord. And again, it just sort of adds this extra cadence that kind of breaks up the repetition of the chorus, and it really helped the chorus come alive. So yeah, what we ended up doing was going through one layer at a time and punching that one chord in each of the spots in the chorus where we needed it. You can't tell at all. It was just completely seamless. Boy, now that I have this workflow where I know I can do that, I kind of want to have that flexibility for any record that I make. I mean, with a MIDI record or, something done with programmed elements, it's a lot easier to change a note at a moment's notice. But for a rock production or something with audio, that's a lot more challenging. With this digital workflow that I have, it was very much possible. I'll play you that part so you can hear it.
We might be dead, can we figure it out? It's in my head.
I'm playing off the master recording here. You would never know that I punched that chord way late in the game. And on to vocals. So the vocals for Figured Out were recorded right here in this room. You can pull that out and make a little booth. I'll show it to you in a second. And then what we want is for the singer to be singing into the room, not, you don't want him up against a wall. If the singer's up against the wall, you could get some phase cancellations and like reflections. So we're trying to avoid reflections. And so I have the singer singing into a sound panel that's located over here on this other side of the room. So basically allowing the sound to project, but then being absorbed by a sound panel on the other side. In my estimation, that's been the best way to capture vocals, in a room. Let me show you a picture of Brian, our singer, singing with the Townsend microphone, which I'll show you in a second. And there's Brian, our singer, singing into the Townsend Labs Sphere Microphone. I've got the original model, the L22. Basically what this is a microphone modeling system. And I get great results with this microphone, so I'm really pleased with it. I'll show you all the settings that we use in a second. Just a couple things to note here. He is using a pop filter. That's an important piece of gear, just to make sure we don't have any big plosives that end up on the microphone. And then there is a little bit of a distance. You'll notice you go about this much, so maybe about 6 inches. It's good to be behind the microphone. You don't want to be too close to it. Tends to get a better sound a little further back. You get too close to it, the proximity effect might kick in and it kind of gets a lot of extra bottom end. So we try to avoid that. But yeah, that's Brian singing right over there. And this is the GIK acoustic panel right here. And this is also a sound panel. This is a bass trap that is behind him. So he kind of has paneling all around. And then here's the vocal chain that we use to capture the vocals. So we've got on that unison slot. Again, this changes the sound at the input source. This is a Neve 1073 preamp modeler. So what we're getting with this is a little bit of color, a little bit of saturation, warms it up a touch. And we often do a little bit of EQ here too. So I'm adding a tiny bit of top end, a little bit of mid-range here at 3.2. This ended up being a bit of a problem, so I actually don't do this particular move anymore, but we did do it on Figured Out. Pulling out a little bit of the bottom end right here at 110. In fact, I think I could pull out more than what I did here. I think I did that in later songs. And then high pass filter at 80. So just removing all the sub frequencies. That's the 1073. And then one of the other cool things about this is it has a detented preamp. So you can notch it based on what part of the song you're working on. And that was actually really useful for Figured Out because we had a very belted out part that was really loud, and I had to notch back the preamp just a little bit for that. So I think it was just one click back for the parts that he was really yelling and belting it out, and then clicked it up again for the softer parts. So 1073 on the unison, then it goes into the Putnam mics. So this is the microphone modeling system. So this is where it turns that signal into the microphone of choice. And I use the Bill Putnam collection. It's an extra add-on. It's a special collection. I think it's like $300 or something. Definitely worth it if you do have this microphone. Again, if you're not familiar with this system, microphone modeling it takes this hardware microphone and it captures a very dry signal, and then it uses software to turn it into these classic microphones. And so, yeah, the one that we're turning it into right here is part of that Bill Putnam collection. It's a Telefunken 251E. And this microphone sounds absolutely fantastic. I've used it on many, many singers, but it just sounds great on Brian. Nice silky top end, just super well balanced. This is my microphone of choice for vocals almost all the time. And then from there, we're running it into a distressor. If you're not familiar with the distressor, it's a compressor. I used to have the hardware versions. We had a couple of them back in my old studio. This is the software version here. Basically, what I'm doing is just getting a little bit of compression, not much. I just want to kiss it just a touch and maybe knock back some of those peaks. So we go into opto mode. So that's going to be slow attack, fast release. So not really affecting the attack and release too much. It basically functions like an LA2A. 3-to-1, so not a ton of compression there. I do like hitting this button. The Distressor 2 is just a saturation button. It adds a little bit of color going into the computer, and I do often like that. The trick here is you're kind of riding the input and the output based on what kind of signal you're getting. And again, that could change. If it's like a really loud part, it might start blowing up the compressor. If it's a really soft part, you might not be getting any compression. So you kind of need to watch that. I usually like to have these first few green lights lighting up and maybe a little bit on the yellow, but I try to avoid the red when I'm recording. And that seems to work out well. And if I'm using the detented gain knob, then it should be about approximately the same going into the distressor. So anyway, that's it. 1073, Putnam mics, distressor. One other thing to note, though, is that this microphone is a stereo hardware microphone. It comes with a special cable, so you have to plug it in stereo into your Apollo, and then you have to link channels 1 and 2 to be on this one channel. After you've done that, as long as you're in record here, what you're tracking to tape is going to be just a mono signal, either channel 1 or 2. So we'll check out the Pro Tools session for vocals in a second, but just wanted to share a little more about that process. Boy, I wish I could say we nailed it on the first try, but I think we may have recut a few of these vocal parts like 3 times. Sometimes it takes a few tries to get the vocal right. You might think in the moment that you have it, and then you comp it the next day and you listen back and you're like, that's not it. I think that's par for the course for this kind of project, where you really, really care and you are trying to get it right. So yeah, it took a few tries on the vocals. We experimented with different styles of singing. So, originally I think his high part was kind of more of a falsetto chill thing. And then he started belting it out and yelling it. And that was what really made it come alive. So there was that. And then, there's also a lower layer, and that ended up being this chill vibe that really worked well with the yelled vocal on top. It took us a few tries to get that style right. We had to experiment a little bit. So there was that. And then there were also a couple last minute lyric changes. So we had to go in and punch certain things. And it's worth mentioning too, most singers can really only sing for 2 or 3 hours well. After you get to 3-4 hours, it starts to kind of go downhill. So we would try to have shorter sessions and then just do the comping, at a different time. And that worked out really well workflow wise. But yeah, it can take a while to get it right, and the hard news about when you get it wrong is that you're always right if you think it's wrong. And if you think it can be better, You're always right about that too. At a certain point, you just have to say it's done. But when you really, really care, sometimes it takes a few tries to nail it. All right, let's check out the Pro Tools session for vocals. Now, this is the finished vocals that have also been tuned and finalized. I'll let you know my process on that in a second, but just wanted to show you sort of the finished product before the mix. You will notice I have a little bit of plug-in action here. This is really just to get a little compression on the vocals, and all the vocals are going through this vocal listening bus, which also has a little bit of compression, and I am just using a de-esser and some soothe just to kind of manage the high mids. Remember that 3.5K boost that we did on the vocals? That's one of the reasons that I need to have a de-esser and soothe on the vocal listening bus. I don't want it to sound too harsh when I'm listening to vocals, which I spent a lot of time doing. So here's the finished product. What we have is verses are a lead and a double, and those are not panned, so they're in the middle. And then when we get into the chorus, you have the same type of layer, lead and double. And we'll play you a little bit of that finished product vocal. This is the end of verse 1 going into chorus 1.
Maybe it'll help if we're thinking out loud. So take a look around now. Could you tell me what you see? 'Cause I can't even tell. It's in my head. So fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head. It's all I hear now.
You get the idea. So yeah, these are those low vocals, and they're also layered into the chorus.
Maybe it'll help if we're thinking out loud.
So that's layer 1, the verse. Same octave in the chorus. We've got a lead and a double, but again, those are panned a little bit into the sides, sort of like a background vocal.
It's in my head, so fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my
And part of what makes that cool is you got the super chill vocal on the low octave, and then the higher octave is really belting it out.
It's in my head, so fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
The combination of that low part with the high part kind of belted out. It's very dynamic. So what I played you just now was a finished product, but let me show you how we get there. It's a rather tedious process, but definitely a labor of love. So what we usually do when we're tracking is we're setting up a loop. Up here we got loop record currently engaged. So we're looping a section. You can see that section right here. And it'll just repeat this section over and over again. And each take gets captured as a new playlist, and it's color coded as a new color. I prefer to leave it that way in Pro Tools because I use the same track to comp a double after the fact. More on that later. I do like to leave the colors because I appreciate the visual of seeing that they're different. Anyway, I get all those different takes, right? And then we would go here, you'll go new playlist. This is already my comp that we ended up using right here. You can see all the different colors, but you would go new playlist. And then, let's say I'm listening for this first line. This is vocal comping now. I'm going to unsolo this. I'm going to solo this. What we do here is, it's good to know these key commands, but P is up, colon is down, and then I'm soloing each version as we go. So let's listen to this one.
It's in my head. It's in my head.
Used.
It's in my head.
We did end up using, what is it, this colored one and the green one. Now this vocal comping part is a very tedious process, and ask anyone who does it. It's very time consuming, and it's one of the harder things you can do in music production because you have to listen so intently, and you're listening to each line. And I might cut into one line, take one word from one version, take one word from the other, whatever it is that gets me to the result that I want, I'll just comp away until, I'm happy. And that can take quite some time, but definitely worth doing. So, and then this is what we end up with, our finished vocal comp. You can have the singer track the double while listening to the lead. Some singers are really good at that. You can get great results doing that for sure. But the other way to do it is you just take the same track and you duplicate it, and then you comp a double into the lead. So you're listening in context to the lead and the double, and then you're finding out which one kind of matches as a double the best. That's what we ended up doing on a lot of the other songs on the Bandie record, but for this one, I think we were tracking the double to the lead, which is another way to do it. Now, another thing to note, if you do comp the double off the same track as the lead, make sure you don't use the same line twice because they will phase cancel. And that's another reason why those colors really end up being important, because then you can visually see that you're using the same one as well as maybe hear it. And then once you've done the comp, you end up with a track like this, all my different pieces. And we want to clean this up. So first off, I'm making sure I'm not cutting off any breaths. So we want to leave the breaths, more on that later. And then, if we're cutting into a line like this, we'll probably need to do a slightly longer crossfade. So I might do a custom one for that and then just listen to it.
It's in my head.
You can't hear that, and I like that. But I'm going through now and I'm making sure that I'm not cutting off breaths, not cutting into any lines, and making sure that the crossfade points work between sections. And then once I've done that, I'll also do just a batch fade just to be sure. You can go the slightly longer one for this. I mean, we could probably do 8 milliseconds and 10s on the sides, boom. And then that'll fill in any other crossfades that need to be done. And then you're ready for the pre-mixing phase, and that's going to be Melodyne tuning along with the RX treatment that I do before mix. Now with this Melodyne editing, I'm really trying to give it a light touch. I don't want to tune too much because I'm really just trying to tuck certain notes in, and I want it to have sort of an overall sheen to it, kind of similar to what I did with the Beat Detective. But I'm really trying to not tune too much because you can really zap the soul out of the performance if you do that. So to get the Melodyne going, first up, we open this up. By the way, this is called Melodyne Aura, which is a feature of the more recent versions of Pro Tools. Basically, Melodyne is already built into every track. You just have to turn it on. So I'm going to turn it on here. It opens up in its own window. I can pull this up here. So here I can play this first line.
It's in my head.
Now that first note, you can see it. It's a little flat. I might just tuck this one in and maybe leave this one.
It's in my head.
Yeah, and with something like this, I might want to tune this note and leave this inflection as it is. Same thing with this. This note I can tune.
It's in my head.
That sounds, see, that's about as much tuning as I'll do. Sometimes I'll cut the note a little bit. If it drifts off and gets a little out of tune, I might cut the note. But generally speaking, I'm just trying to do a little bit of tuning. I don't want to ruin it. Got this next line.
So fucking loud.
So for something like that, I might cut this note and then tune this note.
Fucking loud.
But then I'll leave this as is because I want this inflection to feel natural. Oftentimes, in my experience, if I tune the destination note and not the inflection, it'll still sound quite natural. Probably wouldn't mess with this too much. Other than that, I might tuck a note in here. Sometimes I'll option click this just to bring it within a range where it's slightly more in tune. But again, I don't want to do too much here.
So fucking loud.
And that's pretty much about as much tuning as I did on this record. One thing to note as well is when I tune the double, this is important. I'll tune the double in context with the single playing as well. So I'm hearing both of them while I tune the double only. And the key here with the single and double combination, it's very important to not tune the double too much, because what happens is the note will be so locked on that you miss out on that cool chorusing effect that is really like a hallmark of combining a single and a double together. And that really applies to most rock music, but especially this song. And of course, there's a lot more you can do with Melodyne software. It is extremely powerful for tuning. So I'm kind of giving it that light touch so we don't have to go too deep, but you can do a lot more with it as well. And then once I get the tuning exactly the way I like it, and to be clear, I'm putting an enormous amount of energy into the vocals. So the comping, the editing, the tuning, this is a very time consuming phase of the production process, but it's really essential because vocals are so important. So assuming I've got all the Melodyne edits the way I like them, then I'm ready to finalize the vocal and get ready to mix. And to do that, I'm going to print my Melodyne edits, and I'm also going to add a couple plugins that are sort of essential before mixing. One of those is RX breath control. This is just going to basically turn down the breaths a little bit. And then RX mouth declick, which basically gets rid of any kind of like lip smacky type sounds, which can be really problematic when you're mixing. If you're not familiar with the RX suite of plugins, they're basically like cleanup tools and they're pretty essential for mixing. I usually use the stock settings on this. I've got all my Melodyne edits the way I like them. I'm going to put this track volume to 0 and then basically go commit, boom. That's going to commit all my edits along with the RX processing to a brand new track. And then vocals are ready for mixing. Okay, we're getting into the mix now. Now for mixing, I use a mixing template that was designed by Andrew Sheps. There is a video about it on Pure Mix if you want to check it out and learn more about it. But basically what the template allows you to do is to import in some tracks that provide you with the architecture of your session, as well as all of your parallels and effect sends and mix bus processing and so forth. So basically, I don't have to deal with any of the technical stuff and I can just focus on creativity. So let me show you what the mix template looks like. Okay, so here is the mix template session. You can see there really are no audio tracks here. Basically what I have are AUX tracks and more AUX tracks, some master faders and VCA faders as well. So basically what we have here is all of the architecture of the mix session without the audio. Let's look at the kick AUX, right? So this has some plugins that I like to put on my kick AUX. It also has the sends that I tend to like on my kick AUX as well, already set up. They're not engaged, they're just ready to go. Down here, we've got all of the parallels and reverbs for drums. That's what those blue tracks mean. And note that all of these tracks have the input named after the processing. That way, when I'm pulling up a send, I can just go to the bus menu and I can pick exactly which effect I'm sending to, and I don't have to remember what bus it is. And note also, it has all of my mix bus processing. Okay, let's check out the drum mix. So we're going to start with the kick drum. And for the kick drum, we've basically got those sounds from 64 Sound, kick in and kick out. And I've basically gated all of those tracks. If you're not familiar with a gate basically shuts off the signal below a threshold. So what that's going to allow you to do is hear only the kick firing and not any bleed between the notes like snare notes or hi-hats. So I ended up duplicating it out because there was an issue with the firing of the gate. But basically these 4 tracks are really just the kick in and the kick out. Then this track here is a kick replacer track that is basically a triggered kick drum. And I used the plugin Trigger 2 to print this to audio. So all of the gates have been printed to audio here. And then this is that kick drum trigger. Now the kick drum trigger is actually carrying the weight of most of the low end. The other sounds are then utilized just to sort of supplement and to make it sound natural. So it really is just a blend of all of these sounds with the kick replacer really carrying the weight of the low end. So let's check out some of the plugins that we used here. On the kick in, we're basically rolling off everything below 515 in a gentle slope here. That's because I only want the kick replacer sound to be the low end. I don't want a doubling up effect of the low end here. Neutron, this is just giving me a little bit of transient shaping, so a little bit of attack. This actually has nothing on it. I'm not sure why that's still engaged. This is an SSLG channel strip, so adding a little bit of 3K, so that's going to be a little bit of attack on the kick. And then here we've got some saturation above 2K. All those plugins are duplicated here because it's basically the same track. And then let's check out the kick out. So the kick out right here are basically dialing out resonances. If you're not familiar with this idea, oftentimes there's things that will kind of poke out in the frequency spectrum and we need to dial those out. So that's what I've done here, is dialing out some mid-range resonances. And then also removing low-end content from this one as well, but not quite as much. You can see there's a little bit more coming through. Some of the same moves that we saw before with the transient shaping and the Saturn. And then on our kick replacer track, we're accentuating what we call the fundamental, which is at 53, removing a little bit above that. Now this is going to make room for a little bit of bass, and then adding just a little bit here at 127. Now let's just listen to what the kick sounds like just soloed. So you can hear that there's no bleed, and the gates have been tremendous in helping us with that. So all of these sources for the kick drum have been checked for phase coherence, and then you can see they all go down to this kick augs, which is down here. The kick augs then ends up being another jump off point for more processing, which we'll get into later. But basically what I did is I found a way to blend them together in a way that sounds natural, and then we sum them to an augs. This VCA fader basically controls all of the kick sources. So if I turn it up, you can see they all go up uniformly or down uniformly. So it's a controller for that group of kick sources. Okay, let's check out the snare drum. Now the snare drum has 6 sources. So these 3 sources right here are triggered drums, so they're samples. And then these 3 are the audio from 64 Sound. Let's give a listen to some of these triggered sounds. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. And here's the third one. So that third one is kind of like a piccolo snare. It's the combination of the different sounds that really makes the snare sound what it is. So let's check out some of the plugins that we used. Right here we've got, okay, this would be accentuating the fundamental of the snare while dipping a little bit of low mids above that. Adding some transient shaper. This second snare drum, I'm dialing out some mid-range. This is probably invariably to make it fit with the other snare drum sources. Sometimes you'll get a big build-up or pile-up of information in one area. If you can remove that, it'll sound a little more balanced. Time adjuster for phase adjustment. Apparently it did not need to be flipped. Transient shaper for some attack. More removal of mid-range here. This is probably to make it fit with the other snare drum sources, but maybe with the vocal as well. And then some more transient shaping. The piccolo snare, no plugins whatsoever. Just kind of blended in there. Now, as far as the live sounds, did quite a bit more EQ. This is pretty common for me. I'll oftentimes dial out mid-range resonances just to try and get the sound to be a little more balanced before doing anything else. So that's what I'm doing here. Here I'm removing the fundamental and removing some low end. More EQ to make it fit. Some transient shaping, a little bit of attack added. And some 3K. Now that 3K move and 5K for some presence, but the 3K move is a good move on a snare drum. That's going to be sort of that crack of the snare drum, and this is oftentimes something that I'll add. So same sort of plugins here because that's the same mic. And then the snare bottom, dialing out some low mids and removing some low end, and that's about it. Now, one thing that is kind of hard to demonstrate is that all of these tracks were carefully blended to get to the snare drum sound that we ended up with. You can see where all the faders are at, but that was done kind of in the moment, turning things up and down. I'll solo the snare drum so you can just hear the snare drum blend. And then the snare augs has some processing on it. So we've got an 1176 slow attack, faster release. This is kind of running somewhat in parallel because the mix isn't all the way up. More transient shaping, a little bit of attack added here. Some Saturn warm tape above about 2K. This is a common move for me on drums. I love the way tape saturation sounds on the highs on kicks and snares in particular. Dialing out a little bit of mid-range here. And then this is an important move. Again, we're adding more attack, more of that 3K, and then a little bit of 8K presence just to make that kick drum cut through. This is common on a rock mix. So we've got kick and snare, and those two augses are then being fed into some additional parallels. These are basically compressors, reverbs, and saturators for the kick and snare. So what we've got here is kick snare crush. That is a DBX 160. That comes from Andrew Sheps's template. Drum verb 2, I just got a tiny bit on the kick, a little more on the snare. But that's a larger reverb for the drums. What do we have here? Smooth Room, Valhalla. Now notice I'm cutting off some of the highs and I'm cutting off a lot of the lows just to keep the reverb mid-range focused. What else we got here? The Fatso, that's a saturator that comes from the Andrew Sheps template as well. I usually leave it on the stock setting if I'm happy with it. Looks like that was sent at 0. Kick snare sidechain, this becomes useful later on because I do like things that kind of duck a little bit off the kick and snare, so more on that later. But a couple other parallels, drum crush, drum distressor, and kick snare distortion, which wasn't used very much. But it might be worth explaining a little bit about what these parallels are. So basically, these parallels are compressors and saturators that are used in combination with the dry signal. So you've got your dry kick, and then you send it to a parallel, and you're blending those, right? So the drum crush, to be specific, is an all buttons in 1176. You can see if I play this, you're going to see this. Yeah, getting tons of compression on this drum crush bus. That's one of the advantages of the whole parallel thing is you can go with a lot more compression on your compressor because you know you also have the dry signal to blend with. So it helps to add a lot of thickness. Looks like I was also doing a little bit of EQ on that one, just dialing out a little mid-range to make it fit. The other one would be the drum distressor, using a 6:1 ratio. I've got some of these engaged to add a little saturation. And we've got more parallels going on the snare augs than we do on the kick, mainly because we have a snare reverb. Now, the snare reverb is a gated reverb, which is common on a rock mix. We've got the large gated snare, Valhalla Vintage Verb. And basically what that is it's a large reverb that gets gated. So as the signal decays beyond a certain point, it's going to get cut off. So you get a lot of reverb, but you can control the length of the tail. Little bit of this kick snare distortion. It doesn't look like I was using a lot of that on this, but basically that's a distortion for the drums. That's right here. What is it? We've got rolling off low end. It's using this British pop amp and then dialing out some harsh frequencies from that and compressing it further. So, but we didn't really use that a lot. Now, you know, we did do a little bit of compression on the snare augs there, but there's more compression happening through those same sends that we used on the kick. So we're sending to kick snare crush and to drum crush, also sending to the Fatso, which is really just a saturator. Then we're sending to the kick snare sidechain, so more on that later. Drum verb 2, remember that was the one that we used on the kick, but we got a little more on the snare. We've also got the drum distressor on the snare augs. And then this cool snare delay thing, which we'll get into. Now, the snare delay is something that happens in just the verse. Let me play it for you. Again, it only happens in the verse, but it's a really cool addition. I love little things like that. Okay, so we made it through kick and snare. Now, the kick and snare augses then go to an all drums augs. So that would be this right here, and that goes to the mix bus. One more thing worth mentioning is that I do have some automation on a few of these sends. So for instance, the drum crush looks like it kicks in only in the chorus and then also in verse 2, but we have it omitted from the entire verse 1. And of course that snare delay is only coming in verse 1 and verse 2. Okay, now we're going to get into these other drum microphones that were used to capture the drums at 64 sound. If you remember, we had some room mics, we have the tom mics to go through as well. But most importantly, we're going to check out these overheads. If you remember, the overheads are a stereo pair of microphones that are placed above the kit, and those are going to be capturing that stereo image of the kit from above. And when that is combined with the kick and snare stuff that we did before, it's going to add up to a very powerful sound. So let's check out what we did on the overheads. Let's give a listen first. So that's the overheads just solo, of course, with all the plugins that I used. So let's check out what we did. We've got a Pro Q. This is going to be dialing out some mid-range resonances. If we check it out and play it, you'll actually be able to see that some of these are dynamic EQ bands. If you're not familiar, dynamic EQ will only duck it kind of when it happens, so you're compressing these little bands. So I'll just play it and you can check it out. So yeah, a particular place of concern is oftentimes this area in the high mids and in the highs. We're really trying to make sure that none of this stuff spikes out too hard because it can be kind of damaging to your hearing. And then a lot of this is just kind of dialing out some mud. And then this mid-range band right here, this is oftentimes on cymbals, there'll be this kind of mid-range kind of hum sound kind of thing. So that's kind of just dialing that out so that we can really just hear like the sparkle of the cymbals is really what we're going for with the overheads. So you can see we've also rolled off the low end here at about 98. So we're allowing the kick and the snare sources that we looked at before, those are really handling the bottom end of the kick and snare, while the overheads provides that stereo image and really is there to feature the high end or the cymbals. After that, we've got a compressor. Compression is quite important on overheads. It helps to just kind of manage peaks, but also to bring the cymbal energy under control so that it's not peaking out so hard. So let's check out what we got here. We got a Neve 33609. Looks like I used the overhead setting and then just kind of adjusted it. Yeah, so it's hitting somewhere around 2 or 3 here on the gain reduction. I do have the fast attack engaged, so that means we're going to get a little more of the attack from the kick and snare auxes. This would be a move just to dial in. Okay, so this is going to be just managing a little more of that high mid stuff. Looks like it's about 6K, so that's kind of almost getting into the highs here, but this is a dynamic band, managing some of that harshness. This one right here, this is interesting. This was likely done to get it out of the way of the vocal because the vocal is boosted at 12K on the CQ. We'll get into that later. But what I like to do is kind of carve out that area to make sure that you're not getting any masking, which is what happens when you have information in the same area. So this would have been to kind of get it out of the way of the vocal, which is kind of living up top here. Beyond that, a bunch of 10K. So this is a big shelf of additive high end at 10K. And then it looks like we've dialed out a little bit at 5K too, just to kind of manage that harshness or high mids a little more too. But this is an important move right here, this 10K move, because the cymbals in a rock mix are really going to be something that carries a lot of the top end. Then we've got some Saturn. So this is a common move. I'll oftentimes use Saturn to kind of smooth out the high end. Digital high end can sound just a little prickly, and I just love what tape saturation does to cymbals and vocals and anything with high end really. A little bit of saturation above 5K there. More saturation with the little radiator. And then this would be just some harshness control. This is the Ozone Spectral Shaper, which is similar to Soothe, if you're familiar with Soothe. It's basically like a real-time resonance suppressor, and it's kind of catching any peaks that kind of snuck through. You know, I tried to manage it before, but anything that sneaks through this area 2 to 8K. So I'll play it, you can kind of see what it does. So yeah, not a ton of reduction there, but it is helping to manage this area, which can sound quite harsh. Then we've got our kick snare side chain. So this is going to be a compressor that is linked as a side chain. If you're not familiar with side chain, it's compressing off of an external source, right? So what it's doing is it's compressing off of the kick and snare. So you're just getting a tiny bit of a duck every time the kick and snare fires. And then as far as sends go, yeah, in terms of routing, the rest of all of these mics that we're going to look at are going through what we call the drum kit augs. So all of those sources are going to go through here, and there's a mild amount of saturation on that bus or augs. But the only thing that we're sending to here is the fatso and just a tiny bit. But yeah, we can still send to some of these parallels for some of these other sources, and you can see I've done that. It just doesn't go off of an augs, it goes directly off of the track. So sending the fatso just a little bit. One more cool thing to note is that I did narrow the stereo field a little bit. So here we've got the stereo field is coming in to 72 as opposed to 100. That accomplishes a couple things. Number one, it's going to get the overheads out of the way of the guitars, which will be in the extreme left and right stereo field. It also helps to focus the high end a little bit so that the high end is kind of living a little more in the middle and not all the way to the sides. I don't like the drums to sound super, super wide. I've learned that I like them just a little more contained in. And we'll check out some of these other microphones. So the hi-hat mic, I'm not featuring it a ton. You can see it's turned down quite a bit. I don't really tend to use the hi-hat mic a lot. I'm really more focused on making the overheads the thing that captures the cymbals and the stereo image of the kit. But it is in there a little bit, just kind of buried. Yeah, rolling off low end, controlling some low mids, little transient shaping, adding some brightness up top, giving it, this is some compression and then a little bit of that side chain action. Nothing super remarkable there. In terms of the toms, I'll show you what we did there. Ended up replacing the toms. That's another move that was done with the Trigger 2 plugin. I won't go into that process because it's actually kind of tedious and boring, but let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. But yeah, we replaced the tom sounds and then kind of use it in combination with the original sounds. It looks like it's mostly the replaced sounds that we ended up using. The microphone gets a big mid-range dip and just cutting off some lows and highs. Tom replacer, I'm not even EQing it, just giving it a little bit of attack. Floor got nothing. Same sort of treatment here, adding a little bit of attack on the floor. And then those all get some of these parallels, right? So we've got the fatso, the distressor, probably sent in equal amounts to all of these, right? Yep. And then the drum verb 1, which is a different drum reverb than drum verb 2 that we used on the kick and snare, if you'll remember. So let's check out what drum verb 1 is. A plate, and that would be the drum plate. Rolling off some lows, rolling off some highs, 1.25 seconds. Another thing that I would have done here is check the phase. You kind of need to check the phase every step of the way, but it looks like it did not need to be flipped. But I'm checking it against the overheads is what you would do. These mics are fun. Let's check these out. So here are the room mics that we had. There's also a compressed track right here. So this first one is the kit mic. If you remember, that was just kind of placed in front of the kit. Let's take a listen to the kit mic. I'm going to turn it up just for reference. Oh, I just love that sound. It sounds so cool. And in combination, particularly like the room mics, really help to glue the kit together and make all these sources kind of have some common ground. Really, I end up using the kit and the room mics more for mid-range, as you'll see. So yeah, rolling off lows, rolling off highs, controlling some of that resonance again. You can see these peaks right here. I'm trying to control those because those can be really harsh. Then we've got some compression on an 1176. It looks like it's more of a slow attack and a faster release, 4-1. Hitting around -3, -4 on there. I tend to like putting a transient shaper after compression because the compression has sort of made it a little more consistent, and then the transient shaper can make it pop a little more. So just adding some attack there, adding a tiny bit of 3K, and it looks like a little bit of some mid-range on the kit. 886, and then some decapitator in style P, drive at about 5. So very cool sound in combination. This adds a lot of good mid-range energy. Next up, the R88. It looks like it wasn't featured very much. It's turned way down. So I'll turn it way up just so we can check it out. Looks like that actually is a stereo source. But in any case, I didn't like the way it sounded, so I kept it down. And that's definitely a choice you can make in the mix. Like if you're not feeling it, turn it down. I still did a ton of EQing to try and make it work. Some of the same stuff we're seeing here, controlling mid-range resonances, rolling off highs, rolling off lows. I really tend to like, again, I don't really like the low end or the high end coming from these room mics. A little transient shaping, add a little attack, and a little bit of 3K. But yeah, again, not featured too much. Here we got the stereo room mics. I'll turn those up for a second. Oh, those sound so cool. If you remember, those are, I don't think we saw those in the photo, but those room mics are placed quite a bit further back, so you can hear they're capturing a lot more ambience in the room. More of this stuff, you know, dialing out mid-range, dialing out this cymbal energy, any of these peaks with dynamic EQ, sometimes a combination of dynamic and static EQ. You can see these light up when we hit the cymbals, and that's really something we're trying to control. More transient shaping. This would have been to just kind of fit it in with the other mics, and I'll do this move pretty often. If you hear sort of a pile up in one area, it's good to just kind of do a casual removal and slide it around until the two parts kind of fit better. And I don't remember exactly what I was trying to fit this around, but it must have been the rest of the kit. This is a common move that we'll see quite a bit. One more source here, which is the drum comp. So this would have been a heavily compressed track. I believe it was fed off the kick and snare, if I'm not mistaken, but we'd have to ask Tyler. But let's check this out. Yeah, that sounds like the kick and snare mic to me. So yeah, what I think that was just those are run through, I believe it was an 1178. I'm not really sure. Looks like this was featured a little bit more, and we also sent it to that drum reverb too. But a lot of the same treatment, controlling this big cymbal whir in the middle, managing all that harshness, rolling off lows, rolling off highs. Again, I want the highs to come from the overheads. I want the lows to come from mostly that kick and snare source. What else? A little bit of decapitator, went with style T this time. I probably tried all of these, and T seemed to add up with the other ones the best. And then one more cool thing with the drums, which is this loop that comes in verse 2. And I manufactured this out of, I believe it was from the drum comp track, but I don't remember. Very cool, crunchy kind of sound. That comes in verse 2, so it's a little bit of a breakdown at the beginning of verse 2. And this beat was added sort of like way later in the game. I had printed that. But what do we got? Bunch of British pop amp distorting quite a bit here with Saturn. And then we're managing those high mids, which can be often problematic. And then this is a big telephone filter. If you're not familiar, it's like a band pass. Rolling off lows, rolling off highs. Tends to sound very contained when you do that. So this telephone part really makes the whole mix just kind of collapse down to this limited frequency range. And that is also accentuated by the fact that it's a stereo track, but I made it almost mono by bringing in the sides to 32. Also getting some compression, quite a bit, I think. Also helping that containment factor. All right, that's all of the drum sources. So yeah, all of those go down to this drum kit augs. And then all three of the augses, kick augs, snare augs, and drum kit augs, go then to the all drums augs, which then goes to the mix bus, which is our final summing point. Of course, the parallels that we discussed, they go to the mix bus as well. They do not go to the all drums augs. I do want those separate. I've experimented with this and I found it's best if they go to the mix bus. Okay, almost wrapped up on the drums here. I just wanted to play you a section of it and then we can check out the mix bus. And I want to show you where we're hitting on the meter. So I'll play you a little bit of chorus 1. So that's the full drum mix. Now I am monitoring through a limiter at the moment. If you're not familiar, a limiter is kind of what you use in mastering to make everything loud. So I'm kind of making everything loud with this limiter. But I wanted to show you where this meter is hitting if I turn the limiter off. So I'll turn this off. Yeah, that's actually kind of hot. I think I'm around -12 on these meters. That's about where you want to be. I think you might want to have a little more headroom than that when you start adding the other instruments in. But mixing is very much sort of a, a balancing act where you do a bunch of mixing and then it creates more level and then you have to kind of compensate on the back end and turn things down. So I'm kind of always watching this when I'm mixing. I'm going to turn that limiter on again. And then I wanted to show you something really cool. You just heard the drums with the parallels. So let's play that one more time. Drums with all the parallels, completely mixed. And then just for yucks, I just made all the parallels inactive. Let's check out the drums without any of the parallel stuff. Doesn't sound horrible, but it's definitely not as exciting as it is with all the parallel stuff. So we're getting a lot of thickness, we're getting a lot of glue, we're getting a lot of density, and that comes from the distortion and the compression, sort of bringing out that explosive energy on the drums, which is a big part of modern rock mixing. One other thing I wanted to point out just before we move on is that you'll notice that the drums have been automated here. These automation points are basically for drum fills. There's just so many cool drum fills in this song. I mean, the choruses are pretty much drum solos, and I really wanted to feature those as much as possible. So I basically just turned up the auxes on the drum fills. And that's something that's pretty unique to this song. I might not do that on every song, but since there were so many drum fills, I kind of wanted all those moments to be featured. Okay, there it is. That's our drum mix. Next up, bass. Okay, moving on to bass. Now, if you remember, we captured the bass on 2 tracks. There was one that was a 1073 DI, and then the other one was a GB Tracker DI. So the GB Tracker DI is a little more dry and transparent than the 1073. And we end up using the 1073 as is, but the other sources that we're using are basically the GB Tracker run through some amp simulators. So what I'll do is I'll take that track before I mix. Again, this is kind of similar to that whole process of replacing drums. I'll just reamp the bass through a few different amps and see if I can get something cool. So I have the Ampeg collection, so we were using the B15, and I'll try all the presets and maybe dial it in a little bit to get a sound that I like, and then we'll just print that down. So I did that with this track here. This is a B15, and then we also did that with an SVT track. So that would have been the SVT Ampeg plugin. And then there's another track that we use for fuzz, and that only comes in the chorus and the bridge. So let's check out what we did here. So pretty similar to the drums, just less complicated. We've got these 4 sources. They go down to a bass augs, which is right here, and then we get some additional processing. Let's give it a listen so we can hear what this sounds like. So that's just the 1073, and that sounds fantastic as is. You can see I'm featuring it quite prominently. It's actually the main source for the bass sound. Love that sound. use it all over the place. What did we do to it? Okay, so here we're EQing to get out of the way of the kick drum. If you remember, the kick drum fundamental was around 54. So right where that spot is, we do a shelf, and also there's a low cut that happens a little lower than that. But then what we do is we boost 117 range, which makes it kind of fit in a little better with what the kick drum's doing. Rolling out then this 180 area can sound a little woolly. And then we're also just kind of dialing out some mid-range stuff. 1176 Rev A, getting a ton of compression here. Yeah, that's a fair amount of compression going to -5, -6. Attack is kind of in the middle because we want to hear a little bit of the punch of those notes. Release kind of time to the rhythm of the notes. Time adjuster, this is the move that I'll use to check phase. So I guess it was just on their stock, but did not end up flipping anything. I think this is the track that we compare our phase with. Decapitator style A. I believe this is the Ampex preamp, if I'm not mistaken, but I tend to love this Ampex A on bass. It just has a wonderful low end to it. And then here we're boosting quite a bit more at 75. So we've boosted at this 117, we boosted at 75, and then we've kind of left some room for the kick drum below that. But that's what we got going on that. Let's check out the B15. I'll turn this up so we can hear it a little better. So I'm not sure which preset or which style I was using, but really cool sound. Same sort of thing, boosting around where we want, removing the low end below that, but shelving and not completely removing. Dialing out some low mids, dialing out some mid-range resonances. Time adjuster, looks like it was flipped on this one. So it's a pretty important thing to keep checking your phase on everything, but especially on things that are from the same source and things that have low end information. So this would have been a move just to get it more in phase with the 1073. I had it flipped here. Lots of compression on N1176. Decapitator again. I tend to like Decapitator on bass, but style E just to change it up. And then more of that 75 area that is, the lowest kind of notes on the bass. Next up, SVT. I'll turn this up. Actually, we don't even need to turn it up that much. It's featured kind of prominently. Yeah, so the SVT has a little more bite and attack than the B15. A little more of a rock sound for this one. Same kind of moves here, boosting this area, managing mid-range resonances, right? Lots of 1176. Time adjuster didn't flip it on this one. Decapitator, this time we went with style N, just going down the line. And then boosting a little bit at this 75, but not as much. One more source, this cool fuzz sound. This was done with the Bermuda Triangle plugin going into a B15, but a really cool sound, really, really hairy. Check this out. Really woolly, kind of low mid sound that really fills out the choruses and bridge with that big rock sound. Dialing out quite a bit of lows. I don't like the lows distorting much, so that probably would have been just to get the low mid to happen more on this track. And yeah, dialing out some of this harshness too, right? You can tell this is kind of what I want to go through. I just want to manage these resonances. Lots of compression. Actually, not that much. Decapitator P this time. Time adjuster, it was flipped here, so it was more in phase flip, so we did that. Adding some, what do we got? 2K, which is great for a fuzz bass. It's nice to add a little 2K on a fuzz bass. Keeping this narrow because I do also have a boost on the vocal at like 2.3, I think. So I'm trying to keep it out of the way of that. Boosting 8K as well, a little bit of presence. And then this mid-range frequency is 257, kind of an odd move. But yeah, boosting some low mids, which I don't tend to do that very often, but what you can do is if you do have your low mids organized, or if you sort of clean them up a little bit, this type of move makes a lot more sense. You can add a little bit back in and you won't be kind of adding a giant peak into the equation. One more thing here. And this would have been just more shaping. So this would have been, if I was listening to the combination of the sounds, I'm again using that little subtraction band and kind of moving it around to make it all fit together. I printed all these sounds and then I adjusted the blend to make itself something that was pleasing. I mean, I could do it again, but basically it's where these faders landed, right? So minus 6.9, 1073 is very much featured. B15, not so much. Even though I like the sound, it wasn't featured very much. SVT featured a little more, and then this fuzz part is at 8.2. So, I mean, I know that's kind of relative to the amount of output that's coming out of it, but what I'm trying to say is I get the sounds the way I like them, I make sure they're in phase, and then I blend them down to the bus. And so that's what's happened here. We're blending down to the bus. Down on the bus, we've got what? Old tape, so 15 IPS tape, just driving a little bit. This is gluing the whole sound together a little bit, but not distorting it too much. Spectre, this is a cool plugin. It does it's basically a parametric saturator. So I'm saturating a little more at that 2K. This would have been just to make it fit in with other stuff. So dialing out a little bit of this 415. This might have just been a little too prominent. And I do like a limiter on the bass. It's probably not doing much, maybe just catching a couple peaks here and there. So that's just kind of cleaning up any errant peaks that kind of snuck through. You know, the 1176 is probably going to catch most of them, but then this will get anything that kind of sneaks through. So again, this is just making the bass duck just a little bit when the kick and snare happen, just so that the kick and snare can poke through. Beyond that, tiny bit of this Sunset 2 reverb. And I mean, it's almost inaudible what we're talking about here with the Sunset 2, but I can show you what it is. So yeah, they sampled all the rooms at Sunset Sound. And so this is one of the ISO booths. It would be ISO booth Studio 1. Yeah, it's just adding a tiny bit of ambience. Really not much at all. I do miss it when it's gone, but it is very, very subtle. It's one of those things you just really don't want to add a lot of reverb to low end because it can really get muddy very fast. But other than that, there's this, which is the rear bus. This is something we need to discuss. So this comes from Andrew Sheps's template as well. The rear bus is a parallel compressor for all of the music parts minus the drums, right? So everything, bass, guitars, vocals, all the instrumentation, keyboards if they're in there, gets sent to the rear bus in an equal amount. I always have it set here at 0 when I'm using this. And basically what it's going to give you is just a little more cohesion, a little more density to the music parts specifically. So all the drums get their own parallels, but all the music parts get their own parallel as well. And that would be the rear bus. Now this is something that I've experimented with. I think most of the Bandie record I was using the rear bus on, but I've mixed without it too. And I think, you know, it can work. It worked great on this song. One more thing I wanted to show you in terms of the low end and leveling the bass is the VU meter trick. If you're not familiar with this, there's a lot of information online about it, but basically it's a way to measure your bass into your kick to make sure that you have enough low end, but not too much. So here's how it works. We set up a VU meter on the master. So this is on the master here. This is a free plugin, by the way. It's called vMeter. And then we're going to solo the kick drum as it is mixed. So there's the kick drum. We want this to read right around -3 because then we're going to add the bass into it. And when we add the bass into it, we want an additional 3 units of VU. So this is a way, again, to kind of measure your bass. Usually what I'll do is I'll kind of turn up that bass fader until it hits around 0. And so I'll show you how I do that right now. So we're soloing the kick. We're then going to solo the bass into the kick and see if we can get it to read right around 0. This will be turned down. Turn it up. It's right around 0. That's a little hot. Yeah, so we landed at -13.9. So yeah, you can see it's right around 0. It might go over a little bit or a little under. It is live music, so there is a difference between the hits. And the VU meter works for that because it's RMS, so it's kind of measuring the average of everything. All right, getting into guitars now. We'll start with these verse guitars. I'll play you a little bit. Yeah, and that's what starts the tune. So it's just those guitars soloed. So we spent quite a bit of time making sure that those felt good when we recorded it. Now, those are just power chords with just 2 notes. So just the root and the fifth. We don't do the extra note on top with that one. More on that later. I actually do a guitar breakdown. If you check out my Instagram, I show you how to play some of these guitar parts. But basically, the tone is super, super clean. And clean guitars have a nice transient to them, meaning they have peaks, as opposed to some of these distorted guitars, which really don't have peaks. They're just kind of a little more of a brick wall. So when you do have peaks, you can add a little more compression. So I'll show you what I did there. But let's check out what we did to the guitars. So yeah, these are doubled. Remember, we've got on one side the Telecaster, and on the other side would be the Jazzmaster. So this is pretty common here. Rolling off lows, rolling off super highs, and then just kind of dialing out mid-range resonances. This allows me to boost mids later on, and that's what you'll see here. I've got a boost at 700 plus 4, a boost at 5K is just giving you a little presence, and then a 10K boost as well. But the 700 is really the big mid-range boost here. Other side, same sort of thing. Worth noting, these are different resonances, so I would have dialed these in specific to this track. But then I try to keep this the same. So 700 plus 4, 5K plus 2, 10K plus 2. And both of these tracks are getting a little bit of compression on the API. So you can see this is engaged, and let's see. You can see about 2 or 3 lights light up here. And these are panned stereo. Let's point that out as well. Now, we are actually tucking them in just a little bit because we're reserving those extreme sides of the stereo field for the chorus. So the chorus guitars are panned 100-100. The verse guitars 89-89. That's a little trick just to make the chorus widen a little bit and expand. On the bus here, though, we've got a little bit of warm tape. Nothing too crazy, not distorting it a ton, but adding some saturation. We've got that kick snare side chain, so ducking a little bit off the kick and snare. And then this would have been just a shaping move. I think this is to help it get out of the way of the vocal, actually. But this band was apparently a little bit bothersome. Other than that, sending to the rear bus in equal amount, just like the bass. Same reverb as we used on the bass, so that's that Sunset 2. But also a little bit of this Valhalla vintage instrument reverb that I use. And that one would have been small chamber 2, rolling off some lows, rolling off some highs. That's a common move for me. And then a little bit of saturation on the reverb. That's a cool trick too. Add a little bit of saturation to the reverb. It brings it forward a little bit. That's about it. I mean, the other move that would be, the harder thing to demonstrate is just setting the level, right? Which is basically you're turning that fader up until it feels like it's loud enough. Here I would have probably set the level where the drums kick in.
Yeah, I got it figured out now.
Yeah, I would have set it here, turning it up till it gets a little too loud and backing it off. That's setting the level, and then I would have just set it there. But yeah, all of those verse guitars, so you got verse 1 and verse 2, that was all done in one pass, and then next up we'll get into the chorus guitars. Okay, chorus guitars. Let's go. So if you'll remember, the chorus guitars were recorded with that Russian green Big Muff and the Marshall amp sims. We had the super lead. They sound like this. But what you'll notice is that, like I mentioned, there's very little transient here. Again, that's just the attack of the notes. When you have something that's this distorted, it kind of turns into this like brick wall situation. So you can end up losing a little bit of the definition, which is why when I was mixing this, what we ended up doing was, so these are the ones that were recorded earlier. That's the Russian Green Big Muff with the Marshall. What was happening in the mix, I was really craving just a little more attack from the notes because it was just losing a little bit of definition. So what I did was I took that GB Tracker DI and I printed a track without the Green Big Muff. So just, I think we might have used a tube screamer on there just for a little additional gain. But those guitars were printed and then combined with the sound, and they sound like this. So a little more of an overdrive type sound, not quite as gainy as the other guitars. But what that really allowed me to do is have a little more definition, a little more punch and attack from the guitar notes, and then they kind of spoke in the mix a little better. So let's check out what we did on these guitars. This would be rhythm guitar 1. This one lives on the left side. So yeah, we've got some of the same stuff, dialing out some low mids here. So these are some dynamic bands. Those are just kind of tucking in those low mid frequencies a bit. Then I also dialed out a couple other mid-range resonances, some up here in the harshness area. You know, this is actually where we ended up boosting, 1K and 1.5K. But these EQ bands help me to be able to boost the mids later. Because if there's a big peak on it and then you boost that, that peak becomes way too much. But if I dial in the resonance before, I can then add these broadband additive moves with the API EQ, and it sounds great. So yeah, just dialing out mids, dialing off a bunch of highs and lows. Here's that mid-range additive. So yeah, we're adding a bunch of 1K and a bunch of 1.5K on the API. I just love the way this API EQ sounds on guitars, so this is kind of my go-to. Those are very broadband moves, so the Q is quite wide, and they just bring the mid-range forward, which is important on guitars. And then I was trying to get even more transient out of it, so adding a little bit of attack on the guitar. The Marshall, dialed out a little bit of mids to make it fit with other things, and rolling off lows and highs. That's about it. This would be the second fuzz guitar, so sort of similar moves. The EQ bands might be slightly different. I'm trying to achieve a little bit of balance to the force by dialing out some mid-range, and then we bring it back in with the API. Boom. So yeah, 1K, 1.5K, same moves we did before. And then another thing is I added a tiny bit of 5K for some presence. The Marshall, again, similar moves to what we did before. And then those all stack up and go down to this bus. I did copy out this part for the breakdown that happens before the bridge. I'll play that for you now. I just love the way that sounds. It's super buzzy and I'm super down with it. I think I actually did use RX guitar denoise to denoise this a little bit, but it still ended up being really buzzy. If you're not familiar, that guitar buzz thing is a common problem if you're using single coil pickups, i.e. not humbucker pickups, which is kind of what we're using on the Bandie stuff. It just becomes a part of the sound that disappears when the whole band is playing, but on these sort of isolated moments where it's the only thing playing, you might notice it. So therefore, I did do this little move to make sure that it was a little bit less buzzy, but it still has buzz on it, and I'm actually totally fine with that. But this is getting the same moves as, yeah, so this would have been a copy of Rhythm 2, so it has the same EQ moves there. Now notice that these guitars are panned 100%. So yeah, again, for the chorus, I want it to go a little wider just to make sure that it's really dynamic and that the chorus sort of expands in every direction. But what happens down here on the bus? We've got a tiny bit of warm tape. This is just giving all those layers a little bit of glue. We're doing our kick snare side chain, so ducking a tiny bit off that kick and snare. We can even see this happen in real time if you want. Not compressing a ton, just a little duck on that kick and snare. What else? Tiny bit of bottom end on these guitars. I think I was just missing some fullness and we added, yeah, a little 112, which can work on guitars. I'm also high passing, so it's just a little kind of bump on the low end right before it kind of lobs off. A little more EQ, adding some 4K. I don't know if I would do that move these days. I've kind of moved away from this sort of presence on rhythm guitars thing, but I was craving some of that top end, and that's why we did that. Beyond that, we've got the rear bus. Remember, everything that's not drums goes in equal amounts to the rear bus. Sunset 3, let's check out what Sunset 3 is another one of those sunset sounds. This one is from Studio 2. So it's just an ISO booth, Studio 2, really just adding a tiny bit of space to it. In addition to that, we also add the Valhalla Vintage instrument, which is the same one that's on the rhythm guitars. Again, these reverbs are not doing a lot. You can see this is turned way down. They just give it a tiny bit of space, a little bit of a tail. Anyway, that's the rhythm guitars. You want to hear them soloed? A whole lot of rock. All right, then next up, we're going to get into the lead guitars. So we'll start with this one that comes in the verse. I'll just play you the instrumental mix here. Cool part, it evolved from that original part that was on the demo, if you remember that. But, you know, this is another super duper clean sound. It's a little more chimey and a little more sustained, but it's also very clean. And this guitar is doubled. So same thing here. We've got Telly on the one side and the Jazzmaster on the other side. And so those are double, but then they're sort of panned in. So they're not wide. They're just kind of here at 40 and 40. Similar stuff. Managing mid-range resonance, rolling off even more bottom end because we didn't need it, and then rolling off a lot of top here too. I think I might have added some top back though, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, we're adding a little 10K, which is going to kind of bring some of that back even though we were rolling it off. So a little bit of brightness, and I think we got some compression here. Yeah. So some compression on the API. Second layer, same sort of thing. Managing a little more on the bottom end of here, it looks like. Adding some API, sweetening EQ, and a little bit of compression as well. We'll get to this lead in a second. This is the second verse lead. But those end up going to the bus, which gets what? A little bit of a dip here at 563 and a little bit of a dip here at 6K. So I think this was really to make it fit in with the vocal because the vocal is kind of living in this range. So again, that's probably one of those slotting moves where I'm kind of moving it around and then finding a place where things sort of fit better. And then a little bit of the Tricera chorus on the summer setting. Yeah, this is just to give it a little bit of modulation. So it's got like a little bit of some movement happening beyond just the chimey notes, which just kind of sounded a little stark without it. So I'll play you kind of with and without. With and without. So it's quite subtle, but it does make a difference in kind of making the sound just a little more interesting. But yeah, some of those moves that you do in mixing are really subtle, but they do add up. As far as the sends, we've got rear bus, same thing there. Sunset 2, same reverb as the chorus rhythm guitars, a little more this time. And Valhalla Vintage instrument, so that would be the same one that's on the other guitars as well. A little more on this one because we wanted a little more reverb. And then we've got a quarter note delay here, so I love the space echo setting. I'm rolling off a lot of low, I'm rolling off a lot of high, and it's got quite a bit of feedback. Gives it a nice little tail that sort of lingers for a minute. And then the only other thing we got to check out for these verse lead guitars is this one. Now this one does not go to the bus, so it doesn't go to the augs here. This one went straight to the mix bus because it's, you know, quite different. So I just wanted it to be treated different and not be kind of glued together with these other guitars. Also, because if I would have put that in the same bus, it might have created a little too much level going into here. So something to note. But I'll play you this guitar. This one came in quite late, but we needed something to kind of push this second verse. So this is what we did. So let's check out what we did. Dialing out resonances, trying to get some balance here. And then adding back in 1.5K and 1K. So lots of mid-range boost. shaping it in. Now this would have been to control some of this high end here and also all this area around here. This is a tough area for guitars, really, just anywhere 2 to 5, 6K. It can tend to sound pretty harsh up here, so I'm just managing some of the frequencies there with dynamic bands. Some of these are not dynamic, they're just static and removing. It looks like this one was quite problematic. And this would have been kind of in the way of the kick and snare, even though this is living somewhat in the center channel. So that's another reason to make sure that it's kind of out of the way of the things that live there, right? Panning, just a tiny bit to the left. So just a 6, just to get it out of the way of that lead vocal. That's about it. Spectral shaper, controlling more harshness here. Yeah, so just managing some more high mids there. And then a little bit of tape saturation to glue it all together. As far as sends, rear bus, of course, Sunset 2, we've been using a lot of that. Same Valhalla vintage reverb. And then the spread, this is a cool one. So this comes from the Andrew Shepp's template. Let's see what it is. It's an H910. So if you're not familiar, the spread is sort of a pitch shifting of each of the sides, and there's a little bit of an oscillation to it. You may have heard of micro pitch. That's a Soundtoys plugin. I often use that as well. This is the Eventide EX6, another great plugin for this function. But I'll let you hear what this is doing. I'll play it. Maybe I'll turn it up so you can hear it. I'm going to solo the guitar. So I'm not using that much, but I was accentuating it just so you could hear what it does. So this is a cool thing for things that are lead elements. So what do I mean by lead elements? I mean like a lead vocal or a solo guitar, anything that is supposed to be featured as the main focus sort of and kind of lives in the middle is going to respond quite well to this micro pitch thing. So what it's doing is it's just giving you a little bit of stereo action to something that is basically mono. And you can definitely overuse it. That's why I'm just kind of tucking it in there. One more part to check out, and that would be the chorus lead guitars. I'll play them for you now. And then in the post-chorus, they go up an octave. So what are we doing? More mid-range resonant dialing, just getting out those things that are peaking out a little too hard. We've got an API here that is doing a little bit of compression, but not much. We're kind of lighting up this first light a little bit, but again, these are kind of clean or overdriven guitars. They have a little bit of distortion, but they do respond well to compression, so that's why we're doing that. Gives it a little more apparent volume. Other layer, same sort of thing, although they would be slightly different resonances. Trying to dial out this area a little bit. This was the Jazz Master because it's always a big resonant right around here, so I'm pulling out a bunch of that. These APIs here are just doing compression. Note the EQ is off, but we do end up doing a little bit of EQ down here on the bus. So let's check that out, and we'll check out this lead in a second too. This is just actually a duplicate, if I remember right. Yeah, I had to re-record something. I'm not really sure why, but I had to duplicate this one out for the bridge. And so it's just on a different track because it may have been a slightly different sound. But yeah, down on the bus here, yeah, this is common now, right? So when we go to the bus, that's kind of more we're trying to fit it into the whole big picture of things. So these casual moves, nothing super narrow, just these kind of wide cue moves, moving them around to make them fit in with everything else. And then here we've got some additive EQ. Adding a bunch of 5K and 7K. I think I'm able to do this because we did dial in a lot of like removal in that sort of area as well already. So just getting some more presence. But then again, we also have the spectral shaper, which is kind of managing that. Yeah, so anything that got too resonant, 2 to 8K, is kind of handled by that spectral shaper. So that's helpful. Some tape saturation. Cooking it a little bit. I'll let you hear this with and without. So it just kind of brings it chord a little bit. Gives it a little bit of gel. And then more removal of that harshness area, and then removing some top end as well. Beyond that, there is one other cool section that we need to talk about, and that would be this part right here. After that breakdown I just played you, we actually constructed this way late in the game. So this came during the mix process. We actually added an extra bar to the arrangement, and that's right here. And I'll play you this little moment. This is coming out of the breakdown. Such a cool part. So I just pasted a version of this chorus part, and it's basically solo because there's no other music going on there. Again, we added an extra bar, but I put this filter freak and automated it to kind of open up as we get into that drum fill. So there's also a telephone filter on there to, again, remove highs and lows, make it sound very contained so that when everything kicks in, it's quite dramatic. As far as the bus, rear bus, of course, Sunset 1 this time, just adding a little bit of space. Same Valhalla instrument, probably not a lot, but a little more than the rhythm guitars. And a tiny bit of quarter note delay. Other than that, you can see I've kind of automated it a little bit, just depending on the section. If I needed to hear it a little more, I kind of turned it up in certain spaces. Not by much. This is probably less than a dB. About a dB to make it come out a little more in that bridge part, which gets quite thick. But that's it. That is all of the guitars. Okay, vocals. So the vocals are divided into a few groups. This is verse lead, and this is chorus lead, and then there is a background layer that comes in the chorus, which is basically the low part. Let me explain this to you. So here we've got a lead and a double. And those two tracks get fed into these buses right here. This is a parallel process that I will use sometimes. I'm not using it currently. But yeah, these are both AUX tracks that are fed by these two audio tracks. These two AUX tracks then sum to this track, which is our final summing point before the mix bus. You can see this goes to the mix bus. So again, this is a final summing point, and that final summing point can be used for more processing, and then of course that's where all the parallel and effect sends are as well. This was just simply not used on this version, but this is a parallel process I'll get into later. We did use it on the chorus. So it's inactivated right here for this first part. So let's check out what we did on the vocals. Here's the lead vocal, and I can play you just a little bit.
I got it figured out now.
A kind of whispery, chill, yet ominous performance that Brian did. We spent a lot of time on that vocal. First, doing some de-essing. I tend to do a de-esser right away just to try and knock back any kind of sibilants, S's, T's, K's, just to manage them before we start processing. Because once we start processing, that stuff's going to come out more. This would be just to control the bottom end.
I got it figured out now.
Kind of where that fundamental is. This can get really boomy, this whole area, so I'm really just controlling with that. Then we get into resonance management. So quite a bit going on here. I'll show you what we did. Now this move, and this move are pretty common. I do those on just about every mix. Really what I'm doing is rolling off the subs. I'm using a shelf to turn down the low end even more. And I'm also controlling with this dynamic band, which just kind of tucks in the bottom end even more.
I got it figured out now.
And another one on the second harmonic here, what is that, 246. A lot of control of this bottom end area, and this is just to control ultra high stuff. Beyond that, all of these little bands are dynamic bands managing specific resonances. I can play it and you'll see.
I got it figured out now.
It's just a bunch of little peaks that happen, and those just can become problematic when you're mixing. So this is just, again, just getting some balance to the force here. After that, an 1176 with a faster attack and a fairly fast release. So we're actually grabbing a fair amount of transient here.
I got it figured out now.
but really just getting the bigger peaks. This one isn't doing a ton of compression. And so an 1176 into an LA2A, this is called serial compression, if you've ever heard of that. You basically get a little more bang for buck if you use 2 compressors as opposed to 1 compressor. That way this first 1176 is just grabbing those bigger peaks, and then the LA2A is evening things out, but in a more smooth way after the fact.
I got it figured out now.
So actually, neither one of those is doing a ton of compression, actually. There is more that comes in later on the bus than with the parallels. Then we've got the CQ. This is my go-to for adding top end to the vocal. So just a little bit of a additive band here. The CQ does like a 12K shelf. So basically just adding highs, adding brightness. A very important move on the lead vocal specifically. Then we get into more de-essing.
I got it figured out now.
You can see it's not doing a ton, which is kind of how I want it. I mean, ideally, if I've controlled it with this one, this is the Spectral RX de-esser, by the way. So this one kind of intelligently pulls back the S's. And then this one is just a different kind, but neither one of these is working super hard, but they are controlling the sibilance enough. Beyond that, a little bit of Spectral Shaper.
I got it figured out now.
Just a little more control of this harshness area, like the high mids. So that's kind of like the cleaning up, and we organize later. Mixer by the name of Leslie Braithwaite had a really good analogy for mixing. It's first you got to clean up your room before you organize. So all these plugins here are really just cleaning it up and just kind of making it balanced sounding. On the double, and to be clear, this double is pulled from the same recording session, so it's the same sound, it's just different performances. But the single and the double both live in the middle. So this is a mono lead vocal, basically. And then we did a lot of similar processing on this. So de-esser, Pro and B, managing the bottom end. Yeah, this is just a dynamic EQ on the bottom end there. Resonance management, same thing here, same thing here. Same thing here, I think I did. Yeah, same amount of boost on the CQ. And then a de-esser and a spectral shaper. The only thing that's different on the double track is this right here. And this may seem not important, but it actually is quite important. And this was done because when I'm layering a lead with a double, what can happen is you can get kind of a buildup of certain frequencies. Particularly low mids can be a problem. So what I'm doing here is just ducking a little bit of low mids just to make them fit in with each other a little better and not give me too much muddiness. So that's what we did there. And then you can see the levels on them. If I play them both together, the lead is quite a bit louder than this double in the verse.
I got it figured out now.
So the double is quite buried actually, and just kind of in there for a little bit of thickness and chorusing. That balance will shift in the chorus. There's a lot more double in the chorus. So anyway, again, these 2 tracks sum down to this bus right here, right? And ignore this because we're not using it in this one. And then it gets summed down to here. So this is our final summing point for this layer. And let's check out what we did. A little bit of tape saturation. I love this above 5K tape saturation. Tends to just glue the high end together and smooth things out a little bit. Spectre. This is a move I enjoy on a lead vocal, and that is to boost right between 2 and 3K on a lead vocal. Just kind of helps it cut through the mix a little better. If you think about it, the snare and the kick are being boosted at 3K, so that's a little higher than that. But those things also live in the center channel, just like the lead vocal. So I do need to be kind of careful about this area when I'm considering what to boost in the high mids. But this tends to work really well. And again, so the Spectre is a parametric saturator, basically. So I'm adding a little bit of warm style saturation at 2.3K. Again, this is added to the sum of the 2 as well. A little more de-essing, controlling sibilance, a little more controlling harshness.
I got it figured out now.
You can see it's not really working a ton here.
I guess it only took you coming around.
And then a limiter. This is a move that I will do similar to the bass. I use this vocals natural limiting setting on the Pro Al. And basically what I'm doing is I'm just trying to control any peaks that kind of sneak through.
I got it figured out now.
Yeah, so it's just getting the biggest peaks.
I guess it only took you coming around.
Sort of at the back end there. And then one more de-esser, which probably wasn't
I
doing
got it
anything.
figured
Just
out
doing
now.
a little bit of de-essing. I know that's a lot of de-essers, but none of them are working terribly hard, which is kind of how I like to approach the de-essing, as well as the compression. If you just get them to move a little bit, but then you're stacking them, it tends to work better than having one work really hard. So anyway, that's the main processing on the bus. And then we have a bunch of parallels and effect sends. So let's start here. We got the vocal side chain. Now the vocal side chain is set up for my vocal reverb. Notice I have a compressor on the Valhalla Vintage for vocals. So, and that is connected to the vocal side chain. So I'm side chain compressing the vocal effects off of the vocal. You may ask, why would I do that? Well, basically what's going to happen is the compressor is going to engage when the vocal is singing, and then when it's not singing, it's going to back off. So you get a little bit of a blooming sort of effect of the reverbs after the vocal happens, and this can be very musical sounding.
I got it figured out now.
Okay, so that's the vocal side chain. We've also got the rear bus. This is left over from the Andrew Shep's template, but it's actually turned up just a little bit beyond zero. Aphex, I'm not using a ton of it, but it's basically this kind of grainy high end. A lot of people like using this in the analog world, so I will use that on vocals to get a little more top end. Here we got the Valhalla plate. What is the Valhalla plate? But this process here. Looks like I'm rolling off lows and highs. I do like to do that on my reverbs. And then we've got the medium lithium vocal space Valhalla plate, 1.9 seconds. That also gets a little bit of the vocal side chain as well. And then a tiny bit of tape saturation just to bring the vocal reverb out a little bit, give it a little character. Okay, what else? Here's that micro shift that I use on the vocals. That would be the Soundtoys micro shift. So let's check that one out. Just got the micro shift style 2. Again, this is that sort of pitch shifted oscillation that's going to make it a little bit stereo. Not adding a ton, just a tiny bit. I really kind of don't even want to hear that. I just want it to be subtle. Beyond that, we've got some slap delay. So this is slap 1. Let's see what slap 1 is. EQing out the lows and highs. 88 milliseconds, no feedback, but also rolling more lows and more highs off. And then I even have some soothe on here just to control harshness on the slap. Let you hear that.
I got it figured out now.
That's how it sounds if I turn it up.
I guess it only took you coming
But I
around.
leave it pretty subtle, so we're using it not a ton, just a little bit. Beyond that, we got some parallel compressors. Number 1, a stereo vocal crush, and the stereo vocal crush is an all buttons in 1176. Let's check that one out. That's right here. If you're not familiar with this technique, in the hardware world, you could engage all of these buttons and you would get gobs of compression, which is, so this is a technique that people used to use in the hardware world, but you can also do it in the plugins. And this is a cool thing to add in parallel. Again, when we're in parallel, we have a dry version and a compressed version. So this heavily compressed version is blended in there, and that's what we're hearing here. Other parallels that I have here would be Brower 3. I utilize some parallels that are kind of designed off of Michael Brower's mix template and process. So Brower 3 would be a Fairchild. And I don't think it's doing much in terms of compression.
I got it figured out
No,
now.
it's not. It's really just operating more as a saturator. So what we're getting here is some tube harmonics, as well as a little bit of glue for those 2 layers. Then we got Brower 1. This is an 1176 AE.
I got it figured out
But it looks like it's not
now.
even moving. That's fine. It sounds good. That's all that matters. Now, these decisions with the parallels and the effects were kind of made in the moment. And I'm kind of sending to these different parallels to see which one sounds cool, which kind of makes the mix come alive. And these are the ones I settled on for the verse. I generally go with the Brower 3 on a lead vocal just because that tube saturation really adds some nice harmonics and kind of smooths things out. And then a little bit of that Valhalla Vintage for the vocal, which is small chamber 2. 0.81 seconds, rolling off lows, rolling off highs. That's the first layer, layer 1, verses. You can see I did do some automation, in particular for verse 2, That's because, things get kind of dense in verse 2, so I had to turn up the lead vocal.
Is this getting out of hand now? 'Cause if I'm being honest, I'm super freaked out. So should we slow it down now?
So let's check out the chorus lead vocal. Now, the chorus is quite different than the verse. These are drastically different performances. So I'll just play you a little bit.
It's in my head, so fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
You get the idea. So yeah, this vocal is a lot more belted out. It's quite a different performance. So even though I'm trying to keep things pretty consistent, I did have to do some different Pro Q action on it. Most of these plugins are going to be the same. De-esser, managing bottom end. Here's my resonances for the chorus. There's a bunch more. And I think that was just because the mid-range got a little more intense on the chorus. So I had to do more to just kind of tweeze out and manage that mid-range. 1176. Getting a little more compression this time.
So fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing.
Just a little bit more on the LA2A. Try to keep this consistent with the boost. Same amount of top end boost here. Spectral shaper, managing the harshness. Not doing much, actually.
So fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in.
Tiny bit. It's not really doing much. And then another de-esser. So all this is pretty consistent to what we saw before with the verse. It's just that this Pro Q has more sort of tweezing of resonances. And then we have the double. Double has basically the same stuff except for this final move, which is the same move I did before, but it's in a different place, notice. So 462, another area to kind of remove low mids. And again, this was done to make them fit together, right? Because you got the stack of the lead and double. Again, they're both living in the middle here. Notice the panning is right in the center. But this one in the chorus, the double is quite a bit louder. So it's only a dB quieter than the lead. We get a lot more of that chorusing effect and it sounds a lot thicker.
We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
Cool stuff. This is a VCA controlling these two. Anyway, these two then get sent to this bus and this bus, which are both AUX tracks, right? So they pass audio through. You can see it says lead vocal bus, lead vocal bus. This one's going to be just dry, and then this one's going to be a parallel process, which I can play it for you in a second. It's basically this Pultec trick. It's sort of a homemade multi-band situation that creates a really thick version of the vocal that is extremely balanced. It sounds kind of weird by itself. I can play it for you.
We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
So that's just this Pultec version, and then I'll play you just the dry one.
We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
And then let me play you a little bit muting on and off this Pultec.
We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
You can hear it just adds this super thick and consistent version of the vocal that just kind of sits in the middle. This really helps the vocal to cut through a very dense mix. And that's definitely the situation that we have right here. And since this layer is basically chorus and bridge only, it's basically left on the entire song. Oftentimes I'll mute this if it's going in and out of sections. Yeah, but it looks like it was used the entire song. Okay, and then turn down quite a bit. So this is just kind of blended in there. But remember, these two layers then sum to my combiner track. And that's where we can do some additional processing. And that's where we can send to parallels as well. So what are we doing? I try to keep this consistent as the other one so that it sounds pretty similar. Tape saturation above 5K. Love that sound. A little bit of Spectre at 2.34, same thing. More de-essing. Tiny bit of EQ just to manage. This looks like it was just got a tiny bit. Actually, you know what this is? This is to get it out of the way of the cymbals, believe it or not. So remember, the vocal is boosted at 12K, The cymbals are boosted at 10K. So this tiny little subtle move is just getting the vocal a little bit out of the way of the cymbals and the high end of the drums. This is just managing a little bit of boominess that was apparently bothering me. Then we got the limiter, same kind of deal there. And then knocking off above 16785. This might have been because I'm using saturation. I'm trying to, you can get aliasing if you're using Saturn on high frequencies. So this would be probably just to kind of control that. In terms of sends, vocal sidechain, right? Sending to those effects so that they can duck. Rear bus, same thing there. Aphex, same thing there. Same plate that we use in the verse. A little more of it though, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yep, just a tiny bit more. Micro shift, again, giving us that little oscillation. Maybe I'll let you hear that quick. We'll take this and turn it up just so you can hear it.
We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
So if you turn it up a lot, it starts to sound like an 80s record, like maybe we're listening to New Order or something. That was sort of something that people used quite a bit in the 80s and 90s, and then we kind of settle into turning that down. So yeah, it's not engaged a lot. We're just sending a little bit of it to give it that stereo oscillation. Same slap as the verse, slap 1. Now we have a quarter note delay that's going to give us a nice trail back, right? Hear it? And this is subtle. You kind of only really notice it when it's soloed, but in the mix, it does add a nice tail to it. What about the parallels? Different parallels than the verse, right? We are using our tried and true Brouwer 3, which is the Fairchild, but instead of the 1, we opt for a Brouwer 4. This is going to 4, which is an all buttons in 1176, just a different one. And then our vocal reverb, that's the Valhalla Vintage vocal. So that's it for lead vocals. Getting that glue from these parallels, right? Again, gluing the single and the double together with some saturation and compression is going to give it that density and cohesion. Not a ton of automation on there though. And then that goes to the mix bus. Okay, background vocals now. Now, there aren't a ton of background vocals on this song. It's a fairly mono vocal, actually. What we do have is this lower layer in the chorus, so I'll play that for you.
It's in my head, so fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
So that's the lower octave that happens in the chorus. It's basically the same range as the verse part. So what we get is this upper octave coming in the chorus, and this lower part ends up being a little bit of a background vocal. Now we do have it panned just a little bit. You can see I'm going 30 and 30 to the sides. In terms of track processing, a lot of the same moves here, right? In fact, some of this might have been able to be copied because it was the same range. Yeah, so we're seeing same moves basically here for the most part, spectral shaper, etc. Didn't have to do an EQ on the double because I didn't want the double to sound too different than the single because they're going into the sides just a little bit. But that's the main part for the background vocals is that layer. And those get summed down to my buses down here. Now the background vocal buses are going to be the same exact setup as the lead. This one is that Pultec process that we use. And it looks like it was probably turned on the entire time because it only comes in the chorus. But same thing here, the Pultec helps to bring some thickness into the equation that allows it to kind of cut through the mix a little bit. You can see I did do some mute automation here.
It's in my head.
And I think the mute automation was really just to get rid of noise. So what can happen is if you're feeding signal to some of these parallel things, you might get some extra hiss or noise. So I think I'm just trying to control that. But in terms of processing, Saturn getting a little more of a wide band here, going all the way down to 1.5K. A de-esser. This would have been to help this fit in with the lead. So again, using those little subtractive bands to kind of slot things in and get a little more balance to the frequency spectrum so that things aren't fighting each other or creating pile-ups. Then we got the limiter and a little bit of spectral shaper. This one.
It's in my head.
Oh, it's doing quite a bit actually.
so fucking loud.
I think that's because this is one of those tracks that I had quite a bit of that 3.5K added on the 1073, which created a bunch of harshness that needed to be controlled later. So basically just controlling harshness with that. In terms of sends, some of them are the same, some of them are different. We've got rear bus is the same. Brower 1, if you remember, that was the one that we used on the first layer. So these low vocals get Brower 1. Brower 3, Fairchild. It really softens things and glues things together. Microshift, a little more on this one, I think. Valhalla Vintage Vocal, Valhalla Vintage Plate. Now, I haven't mentioned this, but yeah, I tend to like 2 reverbs on a vocal or on drums too. I think 2, if you can combine a slightly smaller one that just kind of creates some space with another one that has a little bit of tail, that tends to be a very pleasing reverb sound. So I like 2 reverbs. Then this quarter note delay spread. This is a wider quarter note delay that gets kind of spread across the stereo field. And then we're also using the quarter note delay.
It's in my head, so fucking loud. We might be dead or we're losing it now. It's in my head.
Combination with that more yelly lead, sort of a juxtaposition. And a couple other cool little vocal things that come in later in the song. So in this back to bridge part that happens after the breakdown part, we have this cool telephone vocal that comes in. I'll just solo it.
It's in my head. It's in my head.
It's just a little more of a subtle part that comes in. If you did notice, it does pan, and I automated the panning. It goes 40 to the left and then 40 to the right. Now this track was similar, but processed a little differently as well. I mean, so we can use a lot of these same plugins, and it looks like we did. Oh, this is a little different. I'm just kind of controlling some bands here. Needed some soothe on this one. Top end boost looks about the same. This one's getting quite a bit of decapitator, so getting that punish treatment. And then a telephone filter. So that's why this vocal sounds kind of distant and contained, because it has a telephone filter on it, which kind of makes it sound far away and cool and different. It also creates a little contrast to when the chorus comes in full. More compression, more harshness control. In terms of effects, not a lot. Just heading to the rear bus, and then slap number 2 was on here. And this one goes directly to the mix bus. I didn't want to involve it in any of those parallel processes. There is also a little response that comes in later on in chorus 3. This is another little cool little background part that comes in. And this is also panned. So yeah, another part that gets kind of panned. It's basically a call response between the lead and this part. I really like this part. It just kind of adds a little bit of contrast and keeps the interest going in that chorus. One more little tiny tidbit. This is just a little bit of a breath that got pasted in. We needed something to happen in this cool moment where that filter freak thing happened. So I'll just play it for you. Yeah, this is just a little breath, and I added some delay on it. Processing wise, most of the same stuff. I just copied it out, and then we put it to this bus. So it's got a little bit of chorus on it and some different effects, but just a cool little snippet to kind of fill in the air in that spot because it was kind of dead. Beyond that, just a couple other small things that we added in there just for effect. So one of those would be this beginning thing right here, which is a radio static noise. Just kind of wanted something that sounded like tuning into a radio signal. So that's what starts the song out. And then this is extremely subtle, but I think it does make a difference. There's the sound of a wind forest. Can't really hear it, but super subtle. I mean, I was really just finding this intro and the whole beginning of the song to just sound a little too stark. And so this is just to add a little bit of atmosphere. It's super buried and it's hardly in there, and you probably can't even notice it, but I do like adding stuff like that from time to time. Then we got a couple little effects that come in this big climactic moment in the back to bridge before we get into chorus 3. So yeah, that's the one moment in the song where he says, "It's in my," and we just added a little bit of a backwards cymbal in here. And a little bit of a verb effect too. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I printed those and reversed them myself. So this is actually a vocal from the reverb that was printed and then reversed. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. I'll show you how to do it. But that should be just about everything then. That's all of the tracks. So next up, I'll show you what I did on the mix bus and we can wrap it up. Okay, just got one more thing to show you, and that would be what we did on the mix bus. So first up, everything eventually goes to the mix bus. You'll see that all these parallels, all these effects go to the mix bus, but any of the other final summing points. So yeah, this is the final summing point for the background vocals. You can see this lead vocal goes to the mix bus at the end. So yeah, basically everything eventually goes to the mix bus. It usually goes track, augs, and then off to the mix bus. If you're not familiar, when mixing, it's common to put some plugins on the master or mix bus, which is the final summing point before it gets outputted. Those plugins are going to help give the whole mix a little bit of gel and cohesion, and you can do a couple other cool things too. So let's check out what I got on my mix bus. First, Pro Q rolling off super subby stuff below 20 hertz. I am using the SSL-G compressor, so this would be the UAD version of it. Slow attack, fast release means that the attacks are going to pass through, and then the release, I kind of time it to the music often, but this one went with a slightly slower, so it's not all the way fast. 4-to-1. I do have this side chain engaged that helps to make the compressor react less off of the low end, so the kick drum won't affect the compressor quite as much. And then I dial back the mix just a little bit.
I got it figured.
Can't even. I'm not doing a ton. I'm really just getting about 3 dB of compression right in the loud parts there. BX Digital doing some stereo width here. I'm also doing the bass shift. That's right here. So with the bass shift, I'm getting a little bit of a bump in the low end and a little bit of a dip in the low mids, and that's in the mono section, meaning that it's in the middle channel. Pultec Smiley Face EQ. So a boost at 100 and a boost at 10K. So those are basically shelves, just kind of making a smiley face. It helps me make sure that the low end is full, when with the top end, it means I won't have to boost quite as much. Then we got a black box. I leave this on factory default and I don't touch it. Tiny bit of this spectral shaper. I don't think it's doing much. Not even doing anything. So I think I do this as an assurance to make sure I'm not getting any extra high mids, but you can see it's not doing much. Little bit of tape saturation with ozone. This is the clean 15. So not really adding distortion, just a tiny bit of harmonic color just to give it a little bit of gel and cohesion. 15 IPS, nice and clean. And then we've got a limiter on the back end, and I commonly will mix into a limiter at a certain point. I may not use it at the beginning of the mix, but as the mix starts coming along, we engage the limiter to make sure that we can hear it loudly enough. It also gives me a little bit of assurance because the mix will be limited eventually anyway in the mastering process. So when I have a limiter on here just for monitoring, then I'm able to hear what the limiter will do later, and it can kind of affect my mix decisions. So yeah, we're probably not doing a lot here. So yeah, just getting about -3 on here. Again, that's just for monitoring. So, you know, I will bypass it from time to time just to see where our headroom is at. And yeah, this is how the mix would have been printed, with the limiter bypassed and the headroom on the master. So when I print the mix, I turn the limiter off. Then this track is the final summing point. So after it gets the processing on the router track, it goes to this, which is basically going to the output. So this is for monitoring. That's why it's on input here. And I just have some measuring tools on here. So tonal balance control, I can keep an eye on the frequency spectrum, and I do use this quite often to make sure we're hitting those targets. Pro MB, this is a cool thing you can do to kind of solo the different ranges. I'll show you what this does. This is really neat. So I can solo the mids. Or I can solo the high mids. Or the highs. So this is going to give me just those target ranges. I can really clearly hear what's in those ranges and carve out a little bit of EQ space to make sure everything's kind of fitting together. Also helpful for maybe like this fundamental range. Yeah, and I've sort of trained myself to know what I like to hear in these different ranges. So if I'm not hearing what I want, I can make adjustments. But that's just a monitoring trick. And then this Pro Q curve was designed by the consultant who built my room, somebody by the name of Drew Alsbrook. Thank you, Drew, for designing this curve for me. We basically came into this room and shot pink noise into here to see if there were any frequency imbalances. And then he custom designed this curve to make my room just a little more accurate. So that's what this is. Anyway, that's it. That's the whole mix bus. There it is. A whole production figured out, the first edition. I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope you learned something that maybe you can apply to your own music making. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or if you'd like to learn anything else about the tune. And I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Got it